Essaibi-George, who's the original filer for this hearing, and also Councillor Ed Flynn. I want to remind you at this point that this is a public hearing and is being recorded and will be rebroadcast on Comcast 8, RCN 82, Verizon 1964, and also online. Please silence your cell phones and other devices. We will also take public testimony and would appreciate it if you would sign in and check off the box to testify. That sign-in sheet is over in the corner over there. Please state your name and affiliation and residence when you sign in, and also limit your comments to a few minutes to ensure that all comments and concerns can be heard. Today's hearing is on Docket 1040, order for a hearing regarding vacant affordable housing units and improving access to those units in the City of Boston. We have several expected speakers. I'll just have, just note generally, we have 3 panels right now, one representing the City of Boston, who will walk us through the current processes and what's going on with our vacant units. We will also then have an advocates panel, and then finally we'll have a panel with some developers who are currently in the system, who are building and working and trying to make those units available. So without further ado, unless any of my colleagues have an opening statement, we'll get right to it.
Opening statement,
Very well.
if you don't mind. Thank you, Chairman Edwards, for leading us in today's hearing, and thank you to our panelists who will be before us throughout this afternoon. Last year, we held a hearing working with D&D, the BPDA, and DO-IT to better understand and create a better access to our affordable housing lotteries. We learned a lot during that process and looking forward to learning more today. We have been aware that there are a number of vacant units, but it was recently that we learned that there is a greater magnitude to the number of vacants across the city. And we hope to learn more about how many vacant units there are and what the breakdown is between the rental and ownership opportunities of those affordable units. I'm looking forward to hearing from the Department of Neighborhood Development today and the representatives from BPDA, as well as our housing advocates and the developers as well. We know that we have a number of partners in this work that help us as a city not only generally create housing opportunities for our residents, but very specifically to create some affordable opportunities for our residents, both rental and ownership, and creating a more accessible process and creating a more streamlined process is very important to me personally, and I think to the city as a whole. So I look forward to hearing from the panels that will be with us today. I also look forward to hearing from the public testimony that will happen at the end of today's hearing. And in advance, thank you all for being here. Thank you for your attention, both in person and if you're watching at home. And thank you to Councillor Edwards for leading today's discussion. Thank you.
And before you start, I'm sorry, I have a letter from Councillor Ayanna Presley that she asked me to read into the record. Dear Madam Chairwoman, I regret that due to a long-standing scheduling commitment, I will not be able to attend today's Housing and Community Development hearing regarding vacant affordable housing units and improving access to those units in the City of Boston. I want to thank the chair and author of this order for elevating this critical conversation as our communities continue to be impacted by the city's development boom. We must ensure that the new growth and development of our city is accessible and affordable for everyone. That is why we need to examine and improve, where needed, the process to access affordable housing units. As noted, our residents are being asked to pay increasingly more of their disposable income for housing costs, and we need to be intentional in exploring all solutions to our housing crisis. I want to thank the Walsh administration, the Office of Fair Housing, and the Boston Planning and Development Agency for their work. I look forward to continuing this conversation and working with Councillor Essaibi-George and Councillor Edwards in taking the next step towards accomplishing this goal. I will have staff present at the hearing, and I look forward to reviewing the tape. All right. Go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having us here. I'm joined, for the record, my name is Sheila Dillon. I'm Chief of Housing and the Director of the Department of Neighborhood Development. I am joined from D&D by Rick Wilson, our A&F Director, and from my colleagues at the BPDA, Peter Sassa, who oversees compliance, and Tim Davis, who oversees all things affordable housing at the BPDA. We are really looking forward to giving testimony today because we have made very significant progress since this issue really came to light on the backlog of affordable housing units being filled. So if I could, I just want to spend a couple minutes giving you an up-to-the-minute update. I also look forward to highlighting very briefly some of the process improvements that we have put into place, both around the affirmative fair housing process and generally how the citizens of Boston can access information about affordable housing opportunities. So with that as background, the good news is that since Mayor Walsh came into office, the City of Boston, both D&D and the BPDA, have been working very hard to increase our affordable housing stock. Nearly 2,900 new units of affordable housing have been created in 162 projects. Some of these projects, especially if they're market rate with set-aside, affordable set-asides, may have only 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 units in them. But regardless of the size, all of these projects need to be reviewed and monitored by the city to ensure the process of filling these units is fair and in compliance with all federal, state, and municipal requirements. The problem is that this high volume of activity strained the existing systems, and processes that we had in place were backlogged. We had very few staff working, but they were working very, very hard, but they could not keep up with the volume of plans coming at them. In response, the mayor requested that D&D and the Office of Fair Housing and Equity begin discussions to transfer the Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Program to D&D on a pilot basis because we had the infrastructure, the staff capacity, the expertise in affordable housing, and the relationships with developers and marketing agents. And that transfer took place on July 1st of this year. Since then, D&D, working with all of our partners, have implemented a number of measures to work through the backlog and streamline the affirmative marketing process. If I could just outline those briefly for you. We have temporarily reassigned staff at D&D to help with reviewing the backlog of affirmative marketing plans. We currently have anywhere between 4 and 5 staff full-time working on the backlog. We have enhanced our database to track the status of all affordable housing projects by their stage in the marketing process and expected construction completion dates to prioritize the work and ensure timely reviews. So we've really looked at which projects are going to have occupiable units and prioritize those for review. We are conducting twice weekly team meetings with D&D and BPDA staff to review progress and priorities. Those meetings have happened without cancellation, and we take them very seriously. And we've enlisted our innovation and technology team to begin identifying opportunities to improve systems and processes and speed up the review of marketing plans and materials. So we really have enlisted their help to make sure that we are setting up systems to track our progress. This effort has yielded results. In just the past 4 weeks, we have approved 18 marketing plans, 15 advertising strategies, and 3 lottery results. And the lotteries are a significant amount of work because, as you're aware, thousands of people are applying for these opportunities. As of today, we have marketing plans under review for an additional 23 projects. Only 1 of those 23 have a certificate of occupancy in place, meaning all the other ones are still in construction, so we have time to complete our work. Most of these projects are still in construction and many months away from being complete. We are actively reviewing all pending marketing plans and expect to have them approved in the coming weeks. So in total, only 8 projects with 103 vacant units, and I just got the data that you had sought, Councilor. Of the 103, 90 are rentals and 13 are condominium units. So in total, only 8 projects with 103 vacant units are ready for occupancy, but are still going through the affirmative marketing process, meaning they have not yet held a lottery. 99 of these units have been approved for advertising or are currently accepting applications and will be filled in the upcoming months. So our problem really right now is down substantially. We have 103 occupiable units that are now advertising and starting a lottery process. So we are making very, very significant progress. But we know that there's more work to do, and as the purpose of this hearing is to determine strategies for streamlining the process to apply for affordable housing and to create a more rapid and efficient process for occupying affordable housing units, let me update you on some of the strategies the city has been working on so far. We have standardized documents and created templates and checklists to facilitate the creation and review of marketing plans and outreach material. We have created lottery presentations that explain the process and provide estimated timelines and best practices to improve the applicant's experience. There's nothing worse if you're an applicant and you're not hearing back from people or you don't understand the timeline or what to expect. We have created online applications for all projects to make applying for affordable housing easier. And we have dramatically enhanced the Metro List program, which provides information on affordable housing opportunities and resources by creating the Metro List website. We also increased the newsletter frequency from monthly to weekly with affordable housing listings as well as housing search and anti-displacement resources. Since we've made these enhancements, subscriptions to the Metro List newsletter have more than doubled from 6,000 when we started to now more than 13,000. As a result of all of these efforts, we have seen a significant increase in the number of applicants for each affordable unit, which is a good thing, but as a result, it has resulted in increased workload, particularly in responding to constituent inquiries and reviewing lottery application pools. Each lottery, after it happens, we have to go through the lottery pools to make sure people are qualified. Looking forward, we are working to take Metro List to the next level, and our fiscal year 19 budget, thanks to the council, includes a $270,000 investment for further enhancements, such as building a simpler electronic method for property managers to submit their listings, enhancing search and navigation tools on the website, making just it easier for the residents of Boston to find out about opportunities, and connecting better to the interagency effort to create a universal application for affordable housing. And I know, Councillor, that you have been very interested in having this work completed. With that, I will end, but I just want to stress again that we did have a backlog. It was a serious backlog. The mayor has given us a very strict directive that he wanted it fixed. We've been putting a lot of staff on it, but at the same time, it's been a learning process for those at D&D and the BPDA, and we truly are being thoughtful about how we can improve the process going forward. I'm going to conclude there, and I think all of us are here now. That's a summary that we all put together, so we are here now to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we go to questions, I just want to recognize that we've been joined by some of my other colleagues in order of their arrival. Councillor Frank Baker, Councillor Matt O'Malley, Councillor Kim Janey, and Councillor Mark Siomo. I will, so we'll just go straight to questions. You don't have any
I think
other-
so,
okay.
if that's all right with you.
That's fine.
Okay.
I just have two very, very quick questions. Sure. So the formal transfer of the Office of Fair Housing to D&D happened on July 1st, this fiscal year, essentially, right?
Just that component of it.
Right.
Yeah.
And we're now at 103 available, ready to move in affordable units. Is that what you?
Correct.
Okay. What were we at the beginning of the year? It's okay. Do you expect to be able to get through that 103 by the end of this year?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And the other, what's the expectation for what's coming online on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis? What gets in line?
So we are prioritizing. I think probably the best move we made was figuring out when the units were occupiable, and then prioritizing those projects. And that's how we have organized all of our work. So anything that had a certificate of occupancy, or based on where they were in the construction process, we thought was going to have a certificate of occupancy soon, we have prioritized those. So I feel very confident that we will have this backlog taken care of, certainly by the end of the year, if not sooner.
And then my last question is, when you are looking at how you are assigning units in the lottery system, it could have been at one hearing, someone had mentioned possibly D&D considering displacement and/or prioritizing folks who are actually in the neighborhood, who are struggling to stay in the neighborhood, and how, if there's any room for that in that process, not to complicate this any further. But that's one of the frustrations I hear. I'm sure the other counselors here as well, is the lottery comes up and it's folks from other neighborhoods who, have just as much chance as someone who lives in East Boston to get in the East Boston house. So
I can talk about that, and I can give you more information too at some point in the future. So we did get approval from state and HUD to provide some displacement preference for if a neighborhood had a certain composition, and it was racially diverse enough. And Bob Garrett's up here if you really want to drill down on this. We have since then gone to the state, because the state funds a lot of our projects, and requested that of the publicly funded affordable housing projects, that we set aside 1/3 of the units so that we can prioritize those folks, not in a particular neighborhood, because then it becomes very complicated, but households that can show us, Boston households that can show us that they are rent burdened. So if you're of the right income for the unit and you're paying more than 50% of your income towards rent, we want to be able to say to that household, you have priority for 1/3 of the new units in that development, affordable units. That proposal's been at the state. They're reviewing it. They've asked for a lot of additional information. We're providing it. It's going back and forth for too long. But I think it's a very, very worthwhile policy that we need to pursue.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and if you have any questions.
Thank you. Sorry, just taking quick notes here. So I am very happy that you're now overseeing the shop that does these units. Chief Dillon, you've done nothing but remarkable work with Department of Neighborhood Development, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
Do we know, I think it's really important to know, and I know we want to celebrate these very recent successes, but I think it's also important to understand where we've come from so that we're not repeating any of those mistakes down the road. So in 1 month's time, we've been able to identify that there are 103. We've made our accomplishments, the 18, the 15, the 3, the 23. What was the number prior to your shop taking it over? Do we know how many occupiable units were available at that moment?
Yeah, I think, just as a point of clarification, the 103 occupiable units, I don't think that number has changed since we took it over. When we took it over, some of those projects that represent the 103 units were in earlier stages of the process. So they had submitted their marketing plan, but it hadn't been approved. Since we've taken it over, we've moved those projects along in the process so that they are now ready to advertise, or many of them, in fact, are now accepting applications, and will be ready to occupy. We'll have lotteries, and we'll be ready to occupy in the upcoming months.
So where do I get 839 units from 37 projects?
Okay, Tim.
I did want to address that number. This is Tim Davis, for the record, from BPDA. The number that you got, I'm not exactly sure how you got that number, but that was based on 37 projects with over 800 units that were in some stage of the review process at that time. So that includes all those projects that she mentioned that are still in construction. So that does represent a pipeline number, but it does not represent the ones that were actually already occupiable. So in other words, that 103 is of that 800. And so there's many more that are in the pipeline, and that's part of the continuing work is to get that pipeline down so that all projects, when they get to be occupiable, are ready to go.
So over the course of 4 years, we've already occupied 2,900 new affordable units?
We've created 2,900 affordable units. So
that would include...
the vast majority are occupied.
The vast majority are occupied. So I just don't know if the math works out, though, for the number of units that are in the pipeline or could be online. So can someone just walk me through the process, what a developer goes through to, from approval with the number of units, when do we start counting them? how long does it take to get them to occupiable, and then how long does that process take after that?
If Rick could do that,
Well, I don't care
that would be
if that's-
great, because he's been so close to this, so I think he knows the process
Sure.
well.
Yeah, so the first step is when it comes to fair marketing is that the developer working with their marketing agent will submit a draft plan, a marketing plan, to the formerly Office of Fair Housing and Equity, now under D&D, the Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Program. We will review that plan. That plan covers the types of units that are going to be available, the income restrictions. We review that plan. We compare it to the Affordable Housing Agreement with the BPDA or the D&D, what D&D agreed to if it's a D&D funded project. And we'll have some back and forth. If there's questions or concerns, we'll have back and forth with the marketing agent and the developer to make sure that the plan accurately reflects what they should be making available as affordable units. Once that plan is approved, and we try to do that, we ask developers to submit that well in advance of when the certificate of occupancy, when the building's expected to be completed. That doesn't always happen, and we need to, I think, improve that process to ensure that we are aware when building permits are issued and that we are reaching out to developers and marketing agents and reminding them to submit their marketing plan so that we can begin that review process. After the plan is reviewed, we ask them to submit the advertising and outreach materials that they'll be using to market the plan. Those are typically turned around, very quickly in a matter of days. Again, we're comparing that against the plan and the agreement with the BPDA. Once those ads are approved, there's a period they have to advertise the units before they can make applications available. They have to advertise the units in various newspapers, and there's all kinds of requirements around the newspapers and neighborhoods that get covered in those ads. I think that period is two weeks, and then there's the application period. Well, they'll be accepting applications for the units. That has to be done. It could be on-site or within 1 mile of the project. We also, as we mentioned, we also have online applications now, so people can submit applications online. I don't know the time frame for how long that period has to last, but it's weeks that has to, the applications have to be available. 2 weeks? Another 2 weeks, a minimum of 2 weeks that the applications have to be available. During that time frame, we're fielding questions from constituents if they're concerned around the process or unsure of what they're supposed to do or how it works. Once the application deadline comes, the marketing agent typically they'll have a log of all the applicants that were received. They're going to go through that log, make sure there's no duplicates, make sure it's complete, submit that log to us. That's the applicant pool that will be used to create to do the lottery, to assign random numbers to the applicant pool. We review that pool. So every step of the way, we're reviewing every step of the way to make sure that they're complying with all applicable rules and regulations and that the process is being done fairly. The applicant log, once we've reviewed and approved the applicant log, we share it with the developer. We run the lottery, which basically these days is just automated. It's a random number. We just assign a random number, and we give that back to the marketing agent so that they can sort the applicant pool based on the different units that are available and what people are eligible for. At that point, it's out of we consider it, for all intents and purposes, it's out of the fair marketing process, and then it's incumbent upon the marketing agent to go ahead and fill the units, select the applicants, and then it's over depending on whether it's a BPDA project, the BPDA has to income certify and qualify the selected applicants, or D&D has to do that for our projects. Great. Yep. Perfect. So again, it's a pretty complicated process, but it's all done entirely with the goal of ensuring that the process is fair, and we try to make it as efficient as possible. Some of the challenges we have are dealing with, again, getting late submissions from marketing agents and developers. We really do encourage them to submit it early so that we have time to review it. We ask them to give us 10 business days to turn anything around. Many of them give us way more than that, and that's great, and we're happy to review it, but we do prioritize projects that are nearing their completion date. But again, there's certainly improvements that we're looking to make in the process.
Where is the longest hang-up? Where is the delay?
Lottery pools.
Yeah, I think that.
So verifying the log?
Yeah.
Yeah, because there can be 1,000, 2,000 people in a lottery pool, so.
And so how long does that take? What's the average length of time?
We've done some recently, so what would you suggest?
I mean, again, we say 10 business days, give us 10 business days to review it and turn around. That could take longer if we review it and we identify that there are duplicates or people that are being deemed ineligible, and we don't understand why they're being deemed ineligible. And we'll go back to the marketing agent and ask them to explain to us, why are these, why are you deeming these ineligible? Why did you say this person is over income? If we have that kind of back and forth, obviously the process can take longer, but we try to turn around our piece in under 10 days.
And then once those results are sent to the developer, how long before, my goal is to limit the amount of time from occupiable to occupied, whether
Right.
it's rental or ownership.
Well, ideally, all of this is happening before they're occupiable, right? That's the goal, is get this all done before you get your certificate of occupancy. And in most cases, that happens.
Yeah, that's what we wake up every day thinking about. If, when is a unit going to get its certificate of occupancy, and are we giving ourselves enough time to back in to make sure that they're ready to be occupied when the developer says go? So that's the new prioritization at D&D. We're really prioritizing all of our work based on those dates. So you might have a more responsive developer who's saying, get back to me. Right now we're saying, we've got units that are going to be online next month. Sorry, we'll get to you, but we really have to prioritize this work first. And we'll continue doing that until we work through the backlog.
So are you asking now, after that's all done, then the process? Then I could tell you at the BPDA, they come in from the management companies to the BTA. We do a pre-review to make sure they have the files that are needed, and then it goes to our processors to look at. We sometimes need additional updated bank statements, updated pay stubs for our compliance unit. So it usually takes between 4 and 6 weeks by the time it gets through. And it's just been the amount of, in April of 2015, we had 592 units with 50 developments. In April of 2018, we had 1322 with 85 developments. So the incredible amount in the building boom, but we realize it. I also want to say that we implemented at the BPDA, a helpline. So we have it on our website, and I answer about 5 to 6 calls per day of applicants calling in if they have any issues, if there are issues that I need to deal with. If they're facing homelessness, I could look at the application to move it along, or if they're questioning our review of their application, I could always help them out in that way.
Great. And those two numbers that you just shared, and this will be the end of it for me in this round, the 950 and the 1322, I think, were the two numbers you just shared from two different time periods?
592 in... Yes, those are just rentals.
But can you remind me those numbers again?
592, 50 developments in April of 2015, and in 2018, we bumped up to 1322 at 85 developments.
And those were rental units that were occupiable
Yes,
at that time? That's a significant number.
yes.
And
Yeah.
so now we're at 103.
No, these are our total portfolio. In other words, these are the number of units that are in the rental portfolio that BPDA monitors, and that substantial increase from 2015 to 2018. That's just to say how much more work is involved with both the filling those units and the ongoing monitoring of those units.
I get you.
And not justifying the delay, just giving some meat
I
for
get
the
you.
matter.
I get you. No, I appreciate that. Thank you. And so if I'm doing my math here, and then I will wrap up after this, 2, 4, 6, 8, 2, 3, 4 months. But we're hearing of cases where units are unoccupied, occupiable units are not filled for up to 2 years. So I don't know how we get from 2 and 3 months or 4 months with this general description. I get that there are improvements, but I can't wrap my head around 2-year delay, 2.5-year delay in some cases, compared to a 2.5, 3-month description here.
Yeah, I can't speak to the 2.5 years. We do know that, given the volume, that first half, the lottery process was understaffed, and now the appropriate resources are being put on it. So we're hoping that, like I said, anytime a unit is occupiable, that it's got a person or a household identified for that unit. That is our goal, and we're very, very close. For the IDP units, for the developer units, after we've identified the lucky winner, if you will, they are going to the BPDA, and that's a couple of months right now, and I think they're working very hard in getting that number down. So it's a little hard for me to talk about what was, but we were also hearing the complaints, and we know the mayor was personally getting calls, from developers saying, I've got these affordable units, and that's why he jumped in and said, we got to fix this. So I think it was taking a long time. I don't know if it was 2 years, but it was too long.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Flynn?
Yeah. Thank you, Councilor Edwards and Essaibi-George, for sponsoring this hearing. As my fellow councilors have noted, we must streamline placing people in affordable housing units. One of the issues I had as it relates to this issue is the lottery system. There was one case I saw. They were advertising a lottery in downtown Boston, but the pamphlets were only in English, and the contact information was only in English. So I was discouraged to see that. Why wouldn't we want to put something in Spanish or put something in Chinese? Why would we just keep it in English?
So, Councilor, I do know that part of the advertising that we have to approve is indeed making sure that the ads go in El Mundo, that they go into San Pam, that they go into our neighborhood papers in multiple languages. So I will double check and make sure that is always the case on all of these, but I believe it is, but I'll double check on that.
And also these companies that do control the lottery system, are they women-owned, are they minority-owned, are they veteran-owned companies? Or they have their place of employment in Boston? Are their companies are in Roxbury, the South End of Chinatown, or are they outside of the city? What connection do these companies have to the city?
You mean the marketing agents?
Marketing agents.
Many of them are Boston-based, but not all. And I know that one who does a lot of the work is woman-owned, but we can certainly get that breakdown for you. Sometimes developers do it on their own. It works better if they hire someone who actually knows the process, but we can get a breakdown for you for the main management companies and the marketing agents, where they're located and if they're owned by a minority or women.
Yeah, I'd be interested in getting that
Certainly.
data. I was discouraged. There was one company that was headquarters out of Wellesley that was doing all these lotteries. Why can't we hire a company that their place of employment is in Roxbury, the South End, or Chinatown? Why do we have to go so far out of the city to have a company that can do this work? Right.
Well, we don't hire the management or the management companies or the for sale the companies that are doing the selling and renting. That is a consultant that is hired by the developers. But your point is very well taken that we should be looking for diversity in all of our development teams.
Okay, I would be interested in getting some of the data, and I'd also like to get some of the data of women-owned, veteran-owned companies, minority-owned companies that do this work, and compare that to companies outside of Boston. I think that would be important to take a look at.
Certainly, we'll get that for you, Councillor.
Thank you.
Councillor Baker?
Madam Chair, good afternoon, everyone. So we have 103 units with 8 projects. Do we have any sense of what the pipeline looks like for the next year? What do the numbers look like for the next year or 2 years? 103 are occupiable, ready to go now. What do we see next year at this time?
Right. Those are the occupiable units, the projects that have certificates of occupancy. There are 62 total projects that are in some stage of the process of the marketing process. And those 62 projects Again, as Sheila mentioned in her opening statement, 23 of those are in the first stage. They've just submitted their marketing plan. The remainder are further along, so they're advertising, accepting applications, running lotteries.
Their marketing plan, is that, when can you submit a marketing plan? Like when you shovel in the ground, can you submit your marketing plan, or do you need to be almost done with construction?
No, we asked them to, at least 6 months prior to certificate of occupancy, that they're submitting their marketing plan, so we can start the review process, because they want to start marketing them before the building is complete, right, before the certificate of occupancy. So this essentially is our pipeline, I would say, for the next 6 to 9 months. Is 62 projects that we have in our hands. I think, like I said, well, now that it's over at D&D, we have better data. We have the data that the Office of Fair Housing doesn't have about when projects are getting permitted, when they're getting their building permit. So I think our hope is that we can integrate this into our systems and processes and try to make sure that we're getting the plans and getting this information as early in the process as possible so that we don't run into this problem.
So,
Can I just get a point of clarification? I'm sorry. Did you say 62 projects or units?
Projects.
So do you know how many units that is?
Yes, it's 1,700, a little over 1,700 units.
Okay. Sorry, Counselor.
That's okay.
so the point of clarification about some of the marketing requirements. For all the projects that are funded by the Department of Neighborhood Development, they have to submit their marketing plan. Has to be approved in conjunction with the closing of their financing, so at their building permit. So those projects traditionally have gotten a higher priority than the projects of private developers because that's a requirement for their
So
funding.
anybody that takes IDP money or housing trust money,
Correct.
they'll be first in the queue.
Correct. Those are first in the queue. So for the privately created units through the inclusionary development policy, the only requirement previously was that they had to have a marketing plan before they could have the units occupied, which did not give a specific date to it. They were encouraged to do it at least 6 months in advance. Starting recently, we have started putting into our board memos that they have to submit a draft plan at the time of their building permit so that they are triggering that process at the very start, and we can kind of move these along in a more timely fashion so that because they're the ones, sometimes they're focused on getting, bricks in the ground and getting the building up. They're not focused on the units at that point.
Yeah.
But we want to make sure that we're starting that process as soon as possible.
Okay. Marketing agents, what are the requirements for a marketing agent? A marketing agent is just a real estate agent, so any realtor that has listings in any community, Dorchester, South Boston, Roxbury, any realtor in those communities could be a marketing agent?
As these are private developments creating these units, we actually do not require them to use an agent at all. They can come to us directly as a developer. And also because this is a private developer, we do not we don't encourage them to go with any specific marketing agents.
But do you have to be able to be a marketing agent, to be able to run the lotteries? Is there a requirement?
If
No.
you were selling the units, we would be looking, I would think, I know on our end, and D&D would be looking for real estate licenses and proper certifications. If it's rental, they don't have to be. But when D&D funds a project, we are looking for rental and sales agents that have got decades of experience because we're dealing with federal money and they've got to get this right.
So, but there's no certification or
Well,
there's
there
no...
is training. We do bring them in for training, or we go to their facilities for the training to explain to them exactly what the requirements are, especially when they're dealing with our clients.
Okay. So let's talk South Bay. Do they have a plan in place now? South Bay, I think it's 400 and something units. There'll be 60 plus affordables. Where are they in the process? Because they're building their housing now. What's that going to look like for us in the neighborhood?
So I can tell you where that plan is probably, if it has not been signed by Director Gold in the last 2 days, it's on his desk.
Okay. Because I know they were kind of talking about putting money into the IDP, and I think it's a good location for actual units. So I'd like to be able to keep an eye on that. maybe they do some money into IDP, but I think there should be units there.
At this time, their units still are on site. We've
Okay.
not had any discussions about doing otherwise.
Okay. And Sheila, you had touched on a little bit earlier about not a neighborhood preference, but if a neighborhood is diverse enough, the makeup is right, we're able to get a neighborhood preference. Is that what's going to happen at 233 Hancock?
I can check on that particular neighborhood.
check on that.
There are very few neighborhoods that we were getting to this requirement from both HUD and the state. There were very few neighborhoods that were meeting their exact definition. I can check on that for you. I don't know that one off the top of my head.
I have that one.
You do? Okay,
Yeah.
Tim does.
233 Hancock
Tim's
Street.
getting a star today.
So 233 Hancock Street is not a D&D project. That's one reason why it's
Okay.
not. It's a BPDA-approved private project. That is near the Glover's Corner section of
Yep.
Dorchester. We did approve that as having a neighborhood diversity preservation preference, which is the preference that Sheila was speaking about earlier, or at least a version of it. And we were proud to do that with that project. That project has actually just received an allocation from the very first round of the Community Preservation Act funds to provide even more income-restricted units,
Yeah.
which means it will actually be income-restricted not by our agency, but through the CPA. So I'm not sure if that, we haven't had discussion yet of whether or not that preference will continue through that process or not.
And Tim, maybe you can answer. What is the makeup that we're looking for this to be able to get a neighborhood preference?
The neighborhood cannot be more than 60% of one racial or ethnic group. It also has to have a very substantial level of poverty and persons who are rent burdened.
Okay.
So in other words, even if it's a diverse, wealthy neighborhood, it doesn't function there. It needs to be a diverse neighborhood like that, and Glover's Corner fit that definition.
Yeah. So when Dot Block comes down the line, will we be able to do the same thing there, you think?
We can have those discussions with them. They are already approved without such a preference because they were approved before that preference was created. However, if they do come back for changes,
Yeah.
we can open that discussion with them.
Well, they are coming back for changes. So who on your side will be there to make sure that happens?
That would be me.
Tim.
Okay, good, thank you. There was something else that I had, I'll come back.
Okay.
Thank you.
So Councillor O'Malley had to step out for a wedding, and so he will hopefully come back, but he wanted to make sure that he was there for his constituents in their time of need and celebration. And I also want to acknowledge we've been joined by Councillor Andrea Campbell, Council President. We'll skip Councillor O'Malley and go to Councillor Janey.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Chief Dillon, and all of the panel here this afternoon. Kind of wanted to get more understanding around the 103. Do you have that breakdown by neighborhood? Where can I find that?
Yes. I don't know, do we have it with us? We don't have it, we have it by project, but we don't have it by neighborhood, but we can get that to you later this afternoon.
That would be great. That
Absolutely.
would be great. Just following up on some of the questions by Councilor Baker around the displacement, you know, everyone that I know is rent burdened. So I'm just wondering how we can move forward around making sure that there's real anti-displacement. You talked, Chief Dillon, about the proposal at the state. What needs to happen next? What's happening with this?
Because they fund a lot of our projects, we do need to get their approval on this idea. And so we have proposed a pilot for 2 years because they would want it. It's easier sometimes to get pilots approved. That 1/3 of the affordable housing units that we fund, we would be able to set aside for income qualified households that can demonstrate that they have a rent burden of over 50%. And those are the most extreme cases. And I think it makes so much sense because these units are hard to build, they're expensive to build, so we should be making sure that we're a good matching, we have good matching between those most in need and the new units coming online. It's been at the state now for a while. They want us to look at our existing lotteries to see if it's not already happening, that kind of thing. So they're asking for additional information. We're working on that. the request has just been at the state for a while.
Okay, well, I appreciate your diplomacy there. In terms of just defining affordable, so I think, you know, you hear folks say all the time, what does it really mean to have units that are affordable? So where are you in your process? I see in this booklet talk about looking at wage categories.
So most of the affordable housing portfolio, the existing units in the city of Boston and the new ones that are coming online, and if I'm not answering your question, please let me know. They really do serve a range of affordability. You know, our public housing units serve our most needy, our lowest income, and those are, you don't have to have any income at all. A lot of the new rental units that are coming online are affordable to households making less than $40,000 or $50,000, and lower than that even. Many of them are $30,000 a year. And then the set-aside units that the BPDA is, the program that BPDA is overseeing, the IDP units, they're a slightly higher income. So we really are trying our hardest to create affordable housing units that are affordable to a spectrum, to you know, many different types. I know that sometimes that's controversial, but we hear that we're not building enough units for the middle income, and we also hear we're not building enough units for the poorest among us. So what we really feel like it's our duty and our charge to build units across the spectrum. I think where we get tripped up is we talk about AMIs and BMIs, and I think we need to start talking about income. Like, what do you need to be making to access this unit? And we're trying to be much more intentional about that.
Do you have a chart that if we looked at the 53,000 units,
Sure,
in terms of the goal, if we looked at that as let's say a pie chart, the breakdown of these different categories? Do you have that somewhere?
Yes, absolutely. We have it by what we've created so far, and we can get that over to you. We track every unit that comes online.
And to adjust the AMI scale that looks at surrounding towns, is that also a state issue or something that can be tackled right here?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
So if we wanted to make adjustments to the AMI scale to maybe not include surrounding towns and just looked more closely at Boston, what would that take?
So the reason we keep the AMI measure is because many of the affordable housing projects have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 sources of funding, and they are all using one particular measurement. But if folks, so the AMI, BMI, that's the reason we use AMI. But if we want to, we can just reduce the AMI percentage. So we could have 32% AMI or 35% AMI and achieve, I think, what some of the affordable housing advocates want is it deeper affordability.
Right.
It's a measure. So if we want to get closer to the Boston median income, we could just use a lower AMI. Right. It would have the same impact.
And the IDP is using what, 70%?
The standard policy right now for rentals is 70% of AMI, which is, if you compared Boston median income to area median income, it's around 72% of AMI. So we are kind of targeting those folks who are still below median income when we're at that income range.
So Tim, is there appetite to lower it to 60, let's say?
I think we're going to be looking at the inclusionary development policy and looking at what we can and can't do in terms of getting additional affordability from developers, and whether or not we would look at doing something that is a little more neighborhood-based. But this is kind of the long-range planning for the updates to the inclusionary development policy.
Just a couple of more, Madam Chair. I think it was earlier this year, Chief Dillon, that the mayor had made a comment about increasing from 13% set aside to 20%. And anyone, I guess that doesn't have to be you, Chief Dillon.
I'm not aware of that comment.
It was in the Globe, I think. There was I'll have to look that up, but there was at least interest in exploring the possibility of increasing from 13% to
I'll defer to the BPD.
I think the question is that we've been asked to move it to 20%, not that we've automatically agreeing to that.
Oh, I didn't say anyone agreed to it.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering where we are
I think there's
in
an
that
ask
process.
to go to 20% is the ask, and I think it needs to be balanced with the different kinds of development types in terms of the types of construction, the different kinds of neighborhoods. We don't want to discourage. Right now, we have a policy that's based on 3 different zones of the city, but that's only for the off-site and the contribution levels. For the on-site number, we're using a 13% across the city. We're using a similar AMI across the city. And if we were to increase that in some neighborhoods, that means we would be killing off any development. Because in some neighborhoods, the market rents aren't sufficient to support additional affordability. And in some neighborhoods, could do more. So right now, with a citywide policy, we don't want to kind of kill development in the outer neighborhoods at the same time.
So just to follow up on that, would there be consideration or could there be consideration for some projects to look at, let's say, a lower AMI, like 60% for some?
Right. And we do, again, I think we want to balance off creating additional low and moderate income units with still making certain that there's some units that are available for middle income households. Right now, I mean, you look at our rents, how many units are you going to find in the neighborhoods where they're paying less than $1,400 for a 2-bedroom, which is our 2-bedroom rent. So we're trying to make sure we have, again, kind of units at all income ranges. I think we would consider that. I think we would also look at, and we also have some specific projects that are already beginning to do that are agreeing to do some either more units or at a different AMI. We're asking some of projects now on a case-by-case basis to do that.
And last question, for IDP units, on-site versus money, what kind of considerations do you look at in determining whether it will be money that you'll take the money and we can place it somewhere else, or whether it should be on-site? Are you taking into consideration whether or not an area has mixed income housing already, making sure that we're not kind of segregating folks around income or race? I'm just curious to what you consider, and that's my final question.
Okay. So when the 2015 revision, we gave condominium projects in the downtown neighborhoods kind of the as-of-right option to pay out. They're really not taking that option. Some of them are asking to do off-site units, which are in the same neighborhood or the nearby, instead of doing on-site. When we look at making a decision about whether to let a development do a contribution or offsite, we are looking at the financial feasibility of the project to see that if this option will help the project to go better. And also, 96% of projects do have units on site that we're reviewing. There's some of them will do, we have about 5% that are doing a contribution instead of units on site. And we have a few more that are doing some off-site units. And in some cases, they're doing some units on site and some payout. So we have a combination.
Councilor Siamo?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chief, gentlemen. I came in a little late during your presentation. I just wanted to clarify. So the glut of unoccupied, vacant, affordable units was, and I think we communicated a couple of projects in my district that had that issue. Is it down to 103 now? Is that what I heard?
Right, there's 103 units that are with the D&D right now that have certificates of occupancies that have not gone through their lottery process.
Right.
And we're working on those, we're prioritizing those. I do want to be completely, and Peter Sasso mentioned that there are some units that are completed that are now at the BPDA, and they are doing income certifications, but a buyer or renter has been identified for those units. They're just now doing the final check to make sure they're income qualified. So you're right, it's 103.
And I think I heard that, you know, you were getting a lot of calls, and I want to commend you, the mayor, the administration, for putting the resources necessary to get through that. Just another point of clarification. Does a developer that has 60 units, 13 are affordable. Is he prevented from leasing the market rate before he gets the, okay.
No.
No, okay.
In fact, that was some of the rub. I mean, the developers were saying, where our market rate units are occupied, our affordable units are vacant. So that's something we don't want to hear.
Good, well, good to hear that. And then, when I used to work at the senior center, the frustration was that we have numerous senior housing developments in our district, but our seniors don't necessarily get that as their first choice. And I think that we changed the policy from years ago where you would go to the back of the list if you didn't take that first offering, and it could be, you know, Hyde Park, let's say. Could you go through the eligibility of how can we do a neighborhood preference? And I know it has to do with where the funding comes from. Neighborhood preference, a Boston preference, and then where you don't get to dictate any preference at all.
So we are allowed to, because Boston but we are allowed to have Boston preference for all of our developments,
Yes.
and we take that very seriously, and we use it. So all of the lotteries, all the affordable housing units that come online go to Boston residents first. And so
What is the number of years to be qualified to be a Boston resident? Is it a 5-year look back, or is it 2-year look back?
There actually is no look back.
Yeah.
You have to be a Boston resident at that time of applying, yes.
So we probably should look at that and maybe potentially tighten that up. But so that's in place. Neighborhood preference becomes, because of fair housing, becomes more complicated. And I know we hear in every neighborhood that is something that people would like. At the same time, we can't violate fair housing. So we are trying to work around that. And when a neighborhood, as Tim mentioned, is racially diverse enough, we're applying that. And most recently, we've gone to the state asking for a preference for folks that can really demonstrate financial hardship and rent burden. So we're doing all we can within the law, but we've never been able to say, you live down the street, so therefore you get priority. I will say in elderly developments, and I don't have the exact percentage, although I've heard them, and we could probably get that for you, that when new elderly units come online, the vast majority of our applicants are that have lived in that neighborhood their whole lives, or their adult children or relatives live in that neighborhood. It's rare that elderly people will just venture across, and you know, some will, of course, because they need the housing, but mostly it's for people that have a connection to the neighborhood.
And I think it was mostly BHA that did that, not B'nai B'rith's or JCHE, for example, the private subsidized housing. I guess that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilor Campbell?
Thank you, Councilor Edwards, and thank you, Councilor Essaibi-George, for sponsoring this hearing. And thank you guys for the presentation. I apologize for missing some of it, but I did get a summary update from Councilor Siomo, so thank you. Quick question, I guess this is more for the chair. Have we had a presentation on this?
Not yet.
Okay, thank you. And then just a couple of follow-up questions. And I know, first of all, I'll start by saying I know your jobs are not easy, so thank you. Just in terms of why not, this is going back to Councilor Janey's line of questioning, why not a lower AMI? So right now it's 70%. What does that actually mean in terms of dollars, like income? Which I think what you were saying, Chief Dillon, people they're so confused when you say AMI, like what does that mean to the layperson? But what does that mean when it comes to?
70% of AMI is about $50,000 for a single person.
And when you look at, so I'm putting my District 4 hat on, obviously largely Dorchester, Mattapan, people see that and they're like, I'm already barred. None of this is for me because it's just too high, given the folks who we're talking about who really need it. And of course, some are city employees. I was talking to one of my employees yesterday, our team members who makes a lot less than that, who works for the city of Boston and is struggling to find permanent housing. So what goes into the consideration when deciding what the AMI should be? If it should be 70, 60, or something even lower than that?
So we're looking at, one thing we're looking is balancing the number of units we can get with the AMI in terms of who we're serving. And I think it's important to note that the inclusionary development policy program has about 2,000 units in it citywide out of over 53,000 income-restricted units. So it's only one portion of the picture of affordability in Boston. So that's why, to date, we have kept it as a fairly middle-income focused program, because the other programs don't fund this income level. So that's one of the reasons why we've kept the AMIs in a middle-income range. So because it's not the only program out there.
So putting aside this, so these 2,000 units go to folks who are making 50,000. Around there.
Thereabouts. I mean,
So-
but I don't have the numbers in front of me because I wasn't anticipating this question, but
Okay.
we do have a report released about a year ago that spells out the AMIs of the people who live in our units, and we're going to be releasing a new one, which I can provide to you, but I can say that we have a lot of people in the units that are paying, who have substantially less incomes, some of which have maybe a certificate or some other help. But there's a substantial number that are earning less than 50,000 that are living in the units.
In these 2,000?
In these
that number.
2,000 units, yes.
I
For the
would
home
love to
ownership
see that.
units, they're closer, because they have to afford the mortgage, they're closer to what the program guidelines are.
I would love to see that breakdown as what it means today, and also where are these units? So where do the IDP units tend to be? And does that differ from the other 53,000 income-restricted units that you were just talking about? So are the IDP units downtown for the most part? So I'd love to see, and if they're mostly downtown, and say, the definition is 70% AMI, so those with 50,000 tend to sort of say be downtown, and those who maybe are lesser than that in these income-restricted units or in Dorchester or Mattapan, then I have a problem with that. So I'd love to see this broken apart a little bit. And of those 53,000 income-restricted units, what's the demographic that we're targeting with those units? So what's that income bracket? It's less than 50,000, I'm assuming, but what does that look like?
So I'll be kind of flying with the seat of my pants on this a little bit. But to discuss the first thing about where the units are, again, the 2,000, we had a report a year ago that gives you a map that maps them all out for you. And then we'll be updating that soon as well. That'll just update that map. I can share with you very easily. The
But in
location.
that report, the majority of those IDP units were downtown. They weren't.
Yeah, they are where development is happening.
Right.
So if the development is happening in a neighborhood, it's there. So what we have seen is that, so I think about 10% of the inclusionary development policy units are actually in the Seaport District. And that's the largest neighborhood in terms of where those units are. There's probably 9% in the remainder of South Boston. There's about 9% in the South End. They are mostly in those neighborhoods where you're seeing development. So right now, we're seeing a lot of new units in places like South Boston again, Austin, Brighton, there's a lot of new projects, some in Jamaica Plain, some in East Boston, and yes, considerably fewer in your district. There's a couple of projects coming in right now, but considerably fewer in your district. What was the follow-up question was, overall, the 53,000. I believe, I think the number is about 9,000 units or more are just in the BHA portfolio. So those are for people of very low incomes or no income. And I don't have the numbers of the privately owned, which are many of them are nonprofit owned, income-restricted housing. But again, a very large proportion of those, maybe another 9,000, have Section 8, project-based Section 8 program, which means that those also serve very low-income families. And then we have the additional units that are at 30 and 50 and 60% of area median income. For example, is it 10% set aside? For D&D projects, they're doing a 10% set aside for families making less than 30% of AMI. So
What's that in terms of number?
for a family of 4, it's less than 30, so
yeah.
it'd be 20,000.
30, so I just pulled it up. So D&D funded projects, private affordable housing projects that are non-BHA and non-inclusionary development, the incomes are mostly for the rental between 22,000 and 63,000. So we are trying to encourage developers, affordable housing developers, to do a range of low incomes, because for a while there, they were all doing 60% of AMI. It was a tax credit rent, right? And so we're saying, no, let's do more at, I won't talk in AMIs here, but let's do more from 37 to, 48. So we're asking them to do more in that band. And then, like Tim mentioned, we're also having them do 30% AMI, which is really 22 to 29,000. So we're asking to be competitive now in our funding rounds. We're asking them for more of a range. But I think what would be helpful, and we can certainly supply because we have it, where all the affordable housing units are located by neighborhood. I know that we are working on a database that will show of those units, what's the affordability within each development. It's massive. I mean, I think there's like now 54,000 units in the city. But let's see where we are with that. I know that Amelia was working on that project, but let's get you what we have, just so you can understand where and what we have.
And one thing to say also about the inclusionary development policy is that whereas we've created about 2,000 units through that program that are directly created by the developers, we've also created over 1,000 units with IDP funds. And those are for low to moderate income households, and those projects are more spread out across the city, and those funds are managed and dispersed through Sheila's office in conjunction with other affordable housing
For
funds.
the funds, right.
For the funds. But so those are more spread out across the city.
Yep.
And so downtown development is helping a project on Dot for example.
Yeah, no, and I agree, and I guess I should get, so just looking at, what AMI is, and I think talking about it in terms of incomes is very helpful to the average person. And not just because it makes sense, but also looking at, that dollar amount, you think of so many families that's we're not talking about, right? When you look at the average family who's working, or including working for the city of Boston, who isn't even making that in the struggle to find housing. But where I was going also with this is, obviously, given what we're talking about with BPS and resegregation, segregation, where our quality schools are located. I've had a lot of folks reach out to the office to, of course, connect the issue, which the article didn't do, to the housing, right? And how it can, in housing, in the history of housing and housing policy in the city of Boston from way back when, before I was even born. And why neighborhoods look the way they do, why they present the way they do, why they have resources or better schools than others. And what will shift some of this, not only pushing BPS to make sure that every community has a quality school, but is where people are living, right? So as someone who's representing Mattapan and Dorchester, who knows that the quality of schools have to be improved and they're just not all so great compared to other neighborhoods, housing plays a piece in this, and who lives where. So, and what I mean by that is also who is living in the affordable units, what that means. So are they people with no income, Section 8, to $30,000 living in the Seaport area, along with those who are the 1% or the 9.9%? Is that truly a mixed income community? And if so, what does that mean for the schools and other resources in that community? Or is everyone concentrated in units or areas of poverty where it's literally no income or zero income to $20,000? And what does that mean in terms of the quality of schools and the resources in there? So that's where that line of questioning was coming from, and really looking forward to reviewing the map to see where these units are, and breaking apart the affordable to say, even if it's considered affordable, if I'm living in the Seaport and I have Section 8 or no income and I'm working my way out of that situation, can I still live down in the Seaport? And what does it mean to live in the Seaport and to mix up that neighborhood in terms of income? Because all that has a ripple effect on the other services for those communities. And so that's where that's going. So I really look forward to receiving that information. And I'll just add, I think, some folks have been talking about, at least in Dorchester or parts of District 4, they don't want to see every development project be affordable. They want a true mix. And so for projects that come before them, particularly some of the larger projects, a third be those for those who are really low income, or even maybe some folks who can't get into BHA, still having an opportunity in some of these new developments. A third being workforce development, or those folks who work for the city of Boston, for example, maybe giving priority to folks who work for the city, firefighters, police, teachers. And then a third be market rate. And what that creates for a community, I think is very different. And so that is a conversation that a lot of folks on the ground are having. They're not saying, no, we don't want affordable, but they want to create a community that is truly mixed in many respects. And so that's where all this line of questioning is coming from. So
It's,
thank you,
I
guys.
think, we're hearing it too, and it's hard to sort out all the comments sometimes, so we certainly welcome your opinion and your best thinking on this issue. We did just issue 4 RFPs on city-owned land in Dudley, and it was a third. It was close to the old Senheim model that the South End used so successfully, and a lot of people felt very, very good about that. And then at the end, people did not feel good about it, and they wanted 100% affordable, very low income. So there's a range of opinion out there, and I think we're doing, as you all are doing, trying to sort through all of the different opinions and coming up with compromises and what we see as best. So it's a complicated conversation.
No, I agree. And I'll just quickly add, and then turn back over, but I'll quickly add, with that in particular, we put out 4 parcels, very large. And then people were like, that's a lot of parcels to put out at once.
Yep.
So then the conversation was all over the place. But also, community process, I think, in each district looks a little differently. Some have more layers in other neighborhoods. But I push us and strive to push us to get to what I call the unusual suspects, not everyone who goes to the meetings, but the persons who don't have time, by door knocking them and asking them what they truly want. And I think sometimes the response might be a little different. But thank you, Chief,
Thank you.
for your work. Thank you guys for your work.
And
Thank you.
Councilor Campbell, I did want to thank you for your comments as well. I think you hit upon the issue about, the schools and incomes and neighborhoods. You hit upon the issue of why the fair housing marketing plans are necessary.
Yeah.
Because it's the one way that we can assure that developers are actually advertising more citywide, that people from all over the city have access to those. And it also is one of the challenges to why it's difficult to do a neighborhood preference, is because we want to make sure that we're keeping units as available to people to be able to live in the neighborhoods they want to, rather than just the ones that they already live in.
Thank you. Thank you. Just literally follow-up clarifications. You had mentioned there's 62 projects, 1,700 units that are going to be on the pipeline, right? Those 1,700 are all affordable?
Yeah, those are affordable.
Yes.
And then just in terms of following up on.
Sorry, one point I should clarify about that, though. Of the 1,700, actually, over 450 are actually rehab replacement units, like for the Whittier BHA project. So we still have to approve the plan, because as those units turn over, we need to make sure that they're following fair housing rules. So it's actually, the number of new units is a little under 1,300.
13, okay, only 1,300 new ones. And then in terms of just possible solutions or consideration when we're talking about the pipelines, and if I understand, there's really 2 pipelines you're trying to manage, the projects to the people and the people to the projects, in terms of making sure that they have fair access, that it's communicated on a regular basis for those individuals, and I acknowledge the work you've done with MetroList, making things online, and assuring that they're in more than one language, and also the work that I think is still happening, which is getting the developers to start to put this stuff out, take initiative, versus you asking them, go ahead and put your units on and making an online application. So I appreciate and acknowledge that work. Other things that I'd love for us to consider. You had mentioned that there is no look back for Boston residency. I think that that should be something that's changed. Someone shouldn't be able to move in to the city of Boston the day before the application is due and claim Boston residency to get in the lottery. So
There's a
if we
city,
could-
there's a city council ordinance that defines residency, so we should all look at it collectively.
and make sure that that's actually implemented in the lottery system then,
Yes.
you have someone prove that they meet that ordinance requirement.
Right, but the ordinance is a very, it's a low threshold.
Then we'll raise it. Yeah. Then we should certainly raise it. I'm very concerned that we don't have a look back for that in this policy.
Yes.
The other impact, I know that you looked at neighborhood diversity, but one of the things that I noticed with seniors and families in general is that they're in a neighborhood because of the networks that they also form. So is there any way to look at the impact on children if they have to move across the city and not violating fair housing, and not violating, if there's, like, East Boston Neighborhood Health Center serves an overwhelming amount of immigrants. Their network, their language capability, their ability to work with seniors who don't speak English as a first language, I think is second to none in the state. And so keeping certain seniors in East Boston, I don't know if that's possible to also be considered about when you're looking at neighborhood. And I want to acknowledge the line of questioning and the analysis that Councilor Campbell noted. We have segregated neighborhoods for a reason. So yes, to compensate for that, we don't want to just be neighborhood preference only because we could resegregate. I understand that. But there's certain networks that folks have that I'm wondering if you could still consider the impact on them losing their network or their access to social services without violating fair housing.
We can certainly bring it up to our fair housing professionals. It's, these fair housing conversations are, they're complicated, they're challenging, there's lots of opinion, there's case law, as you know. So, but we'd be glad to talk with the state, you, and our own fair housing professionals about that very issue. I agree that elderly and newly arrived immigrants really benefit from the support networks in their neighborhoods. So sometimes we have competing goals.
True. And then when you had mentioned the private market and the impact on looking at the IDP percentage, so one of the biggest private markets and developments is Suffolk, Downs and East Boston. And I'm wondering what city influence there could be at all in raising the affordability from 13% to, say, 20%. That's to be built. We're talking about almost 10,000, up to 10,000 units. How or can the city, the BPDA, work to get the developer to a higher percentage, or can you?
Well, our project managers really work with the developers on an ongoing basis to it. I mean, there are, as Tim was saying, there's feasibility of the project, the cost feasibility, but that does not negate that we really try to work with them. I mean, it's in our reputation
Of course.
to really help out our citizens, our Boston residents, for housing. So we do work with them. Sometimes our hands are tied. That's why we have minimums, at least, to protect us from there. But we constantly do work on it.
Can you get a private developer to go higher than 13%? Just tell them to?
On a case-by-case basis, we have gotten, developers have agreed to do more.
Okay.
But we do have a policy for a reason to provide some predictability to the process. So that does provide our minimum. I know that you've had some discussions with the developer. I encourage you to continue to have those discussions. And we're certainly having our own discussions with them. But again, we have the policy as today. And if they meet that minimum, then they're at least meeting that expectation. We are do certainly want to see units on site there because we don't want to, but we also want to help East Boston as a whole. So what is it that we can do vis-a-vis maybe any linkage funds that come from there that might be able to use to assist housing affordability for the rest of East Boston is something that's very important to us. That is more kind of what we do with money that comes from the project is something that's more within our capacity to deal with than just saying you have to do more.
Okay. That's it for me.
I have just one brief follow-up question, because we talked about all of this conversation has really been around new units. Can someone just talk about the resale of affordable units when it's ownership and how that process is, how do we regulate that process or overview that process?
I can give a quick overview of the ones that we fund with city-owned money. So we put a deed, a covenant on the property, limiting the amount of appreciation and who the person can resell it to, what income group they have to meet. And we tie that deed to a mortgage, so when there's a title search done and it comes to light, it's very hard to miss. If we encourage folks that own an affordable homeownership unit to contact us, we give them a maximum resale price. It's a very friendly process. There's equity there. And then we say to them, when you find a buyer, come back and we'll income cert, take off the deed restriction, take off that mortgage, and then replace it with to the new buyer and allow for you to receive the equity and a broker's fee, reimbursement for a broker's fee. It's a good process. It works really well. There's, to the best of my knowledge, there's no backlog. Occasionally, there'll be an owner who's having a hard time selling the unit for whatever reason, and we're working with them, and we may even modify the deed restriction to make sure they can sell and move on. So it's a process that works. I don't know if you want to.
We have the same process that we follow pretty accurately, and we try to, they come in for the maximum resale value, because in our units, we require that anybody who owns one of our units in the BPDA, that it has to be owner occupied. So we keep a really strict guidance, and we've gone after people who have rented their units. We're really strict on that to respect the program. For the rentals, we ask for a yearly rental audit of their finances, their taxes, to make sure that they are not over the income. And if not, we do not ask them to be renewed.
Thank you.
Counselor Baker, one more?
So just, who keeps an eye on the projects that don't come in front of the BRA? They'll just need zoning relief or whatever, 12 units, 11 units, because I know, I have one case in front of me that was, I think, 13 units, and they slid under the radar there. That was because they didn't have BRA. It wasn't small project.
Right.
And they just had zoning.
So the projects that are 10 to 14 units do not come in for small project review, that's correct. It has been kind of the task of the planning and design people who review the zoning recommendations to kind of make sure that I'm aware of those projects so that we can then sit down with those developers as well. The system has not always been perfect.
Yeah.
It's certainly something we're trying to improve, and there wasn't actually someone in my role 3 years ago, and now that I am there, that's one of the pieces that I do work. I work with the planning and the zoning staff. We make sure that we identify those projects and make sure that those projects are adhere to the inclusionary development policy.
So like a plans examiner should flag it?
Correct. Correct.
Okay. And another question, what happens if someone, they live 3 years in a income restricted property and then they get a better job or whatever and they go over the income? Do they have to vacate that property?
It varies a little bit from program to program, but for the inclusionary development policy units, so for example, if you rented in a 70% AMI unit, your income can increase until you get up to 110% of AMI, and then we would ask you to leave. So in other words, you can stay, and you're still paying that same rent until you get to that income limit. We find that doesn't happen very much with individuals in our units. Where it happens is when they change their family size. That's what usually happens. So it's a single person, a one bedroom, they get married, they double their income, then they're not income eligible. That's where we usually see the problem happening. It's not usually if it's two people and they have a child, then they're still fine. It's usually when there's a change in their household size in terms of number of earners that we have that problem.
And upon turnover, Tim, like if someone decides to just leave for whatever reason, do those units, do they still go through the same process, a lottery, or like, so a second turnover, or even a third turnover? Do we still have the process like that happened originally?
We have a process of certifying. We don't redo a lottery.
Correct. There's no lottery again, but most of these projects will have wait lists, and if they don't have a wait list, they can do first come, first serve. We're trying to improve the privately owned projects, that they actually submit their units and their availabilities to MetroList,
Yeah.
so that more people can have access to those
And
projects.
they don't necessarily need to
They
submit
don't
this?
necessarily need to, no, not at this time.
So if it was income restricted to start, someone lives there for 5 years, it's in a 10-unit, 11-unit building, vacates, now that owner or whoever can just go find anybody to go in there? There's no way for us, we don't cross-reference that, or what happens at that point?
Well, as he said, we do still recertify their income. They still have to be income and asset eligible for
Oh,
the.
they have to be
eligible.
certified for
Yeah,
income.
it
The
doesn't
unit
free
doesn't
them
need
up.
to be certified.
Yeah, we have a 50-year covenant,
Oh,
usually.
okay,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. So that'll be all the questions we have right now for the panel. We're going to transition to our next panel, and in that time, I'm going to take a 2-minute break. The next panel is John Labella, Chris Norris, and Michael King. Take a small break. We're going to resume the hearing on 1040 with our second panel. An introduction of the folks who are here. We have John Labella from Housing Works, Chris Norris from Metro Housing Boston, and Michael King from the National Alliance of HUD Tenants. We'll go ahead and start with John.
Thank you so much for this chance to testify. My slides contain everything that I want you to know. There are too many, and I'm hoping that the first 10 or so that I show you quickly will be enough to invest you in researching the rest. We manage the housing for 100 affordable properties in the Boston area. We handle the wait lists. We also work with about 254 housing advocates, many of them in city hall departments, who search and apply for housing. And what that means is we actually have information from the moment the person sends her first application to the moment a landlord turns them down or moves them in. And that gives us some very interesting reports. If you want to go to slide 3. You can't talk about affordable housing vacancies without understanding the subsidized world because they impact. At the moment, the worst actual wait time in a 2-bedroom subsidized property in Boston is 18 years. It's not just one person. It's not a freakish outlier, but it's not a large group. In the affordable housing, the worst actual wait time is now up to 13 years. In anticipation of a challenge, we can spend time later at some other point documenting why these numbers are exact as of yesterday. That 18-year wait is now 19 years in those properties. I'm now on slide 5. We also know that at the moment, there are at least in 2018, 2,000 families who are full-time employed in Boston, but who are homeless or at serious risk. And in 2019, that number is up to about 3,300 families. I'm now on slide 7. I'm going to skip that and go to slide 9. This is the Housing Works perspective on the problems. I think what you just heard from the city is such a different description of the problem that it's going to be a wrench for you to go the way that we're going to talk about. And I think I can do this in 3 slides and be done. Certainly the major problem is a disconnect between the service sectors. I'm on the next slide now, which is the 3 circles. If you think of the affordable and subsidized world as being applicants and advocates, the people who manage and handle the wait lists and own the buildings, and then the oversight people. There's a very profound disconnect between them. Two examples that I just heard one of them today. The lottery process is better, but it doesn't take into account what happens right after the lottery. We just handled a lottery. They have 30 units. It cost about $15,000 to do the lottery, and now we're going to spend $30,000 to put those people on the actual wait list the property uses to fill the units. That's too much for a 30-unit building. They can't afford it. The second problem is that, well, we'll just go to the next slide, which is, here's the root of the problem right here. There are 40 different kinds of subsidized and affordable housing, and the same family is going to be eligible for most of it. Now, if you look at that from the city standpoint, the applicant standpoint, and the landlord standpoint, you'll see why we have these vacancies, which are actually underreported in some ways, but also a larger issue. The housing that's being built is not pertinent to the people who are looking for it. If there are 1,000 people applying to 5 of these different types of housing, is that 7,000 people on those 7 wait lists, or is that the same 1,000 people applying to 7 places? The city doesn't know, which means they have no idea what the demand actually is. And they're building without knowing that. That is not a criticism of D&D. I think they're doing a heroic job. But the fact is the housing battlefield is large, and they're in another part of it, and they're not linked to people who are doing these other parts. BPDA is another issue. The bulk of the housing that they're building, the 70% AMI, is actually one of the major contributors to displacement, and having seen now 7 or 8 community open hearings on buildings, they consistently override 100% opposition to what's happening and claim there's not enough opposition, and they build those buildings, and it creates a huge amount of displacement. I urge you to have a BPDA reform hearing at some point. Let's just go to the last slide, and then I'll be done. Those silos, we talked about how they prevent the city from knowing what the demand and the supply is. But if you look at it from the applicant side, it's an impossible task to locate your options. It's impossible, even if you have a master's degree and no disabilities. From the landlord side, do you see this pile of applications here? That's from one property, the lottery that we just ran. Once they go through the lottery, they have to be added to the wait list. People in those moderate AMI units don't wait that long. They don't wait 13 years. They don't wait even 6 months to be advised that they were in the lottery and won it. They're already gone. Last slide, and then I'll be done. We have these wait lists for 100 properties. Across them, there are 36,000 households if I unduplicate, meaning the same person's on many wait lists. Look at the breakdown here. In our 36,000 households, Boston residents, 90% of them are not eligible for anything over the 50% level. 9% are eligible for the 60%, and almost no one for the 70%. That means the people who apply to our buildings, since we have mixed income housing at all of them, nobody's applying for 60 and 70% units almost at all. And the people who are taking those over are outsiders and college students. But even for that group, the rents are so high that actually those 4 college students and that intern who comes for 3 years is not renting in IDP units. They're renting out the cheaper, older stock, and in the process, paying the landlord a little more and displacing the people who live there. So we need to have the AMI, if we're going to use AMI, which is kind of awkward not to use. We need to understand that anything over the 50% level is not affordable, and we need to stop having the city say affordable units are being built when they're not affordable because they're not tied to the median wage. The housing has to be tied to the median wage, which is 50% AMI max. I'm not going to list some other problems. I'm not even going to list the solutions, but I'll give you one. Everyone should be applying through a single system for all 40% kinds of housing. The city already does that with its own departments. They use our system, which means we can give you any day an unduplicated count of how many people looking and what their circumstances are. But there's 1,000 other advocates of the city who voluntarily or not use our system. And if they were encouraged to use it, tooting my own horn, you could have real numbers on what the need is, and then maybe you could decide if there was a way to build. The other solutions that I'm listing are not ours. They're on slide 22. They're from a poll I took from all the stakeholders we work with. Some of them are really fun. Maybe you should force the colleges who are defaulted their pilot to make students rent the IDP units, and that might get them out of the older stock, slightly lower rent housing and prevent some of the displacement. I'll leave it at that, but there's some fun stuff in there. Thank you very much. Hope that wasn't too fast.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Councilor Essaibi-George, Councilor Campbell. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. For the record, my name is Chris Norris, and I'm the Executive Director of Metro Housing Boston. I have submitted written testimony as well as background material to every council office, so you will have that, and I'm happy to follow up in the future on those. Today, I've been asked to discuss our experience with the housing system, challenges, and possible solutions. Metro Housing has 35 years of experience in this arena. Today, we are a full-service, comprehensive, affordable housing and homelessness prevention organization located at Roxbury Crossing. The current housing system, as you just heard from John and pretty much anyone else that you talk to, is fragmented and difficult to navigate when it comes to securing an apartment with rent that is affordable to our clients. The people that we serve have average annual incomes in the range of $9,000 to $15,000 for a family of 3. Over the years, Boston has led the way in producing housing with rents that are below market rate. And there are some very clear and good goals that have been set by the mayor and are being tracked by his team, for which they should be commended. However, when they arrive at Metro Housing, families looking for housing are severely limited in their choices. The market is forcing them into search in areas with high concentrations of poverty or to move out of the city altogether, leaving their support networks, leaving schools, leaving healthcare providers, leaving employment opportunities. Challenges. The primary challenge is the lack of housing that is available and affordable for families who have very low and extremely low incomes. And by that, for us, using the AMI, $48,000, very low income for a family of 3, $29,000 is extremely low. And as you heard from my numbers, our families are half of that. We're not building the supply of housing that's necessary to meet the need, plain and simple. That is one of the reasons why it's so important that every new unit that's built be made available and occupied as soon as possible. Opportunities for housing for the people who seek our assistance are quite limited. By way of example, when Metro Housing opened our mass rental voucher list in 2014, we had 71 vouchers available. The list was open for 1 month. We received 10,000 applications. For Section 8, it's not much different. We haven't seen very much of an increase, if any, in federal rental assistance over the last many years. And in fact, today there are 34,000 unduplicated households on our wait list. And the families that came into our office yesterday to secure a voucher had been on the list 11 years. Accessibility is a second challenge. Nearly 1/4 of the people served by Metro Housing through our leased housing department are elderly, and more than 60% have a household member with a disability. Given the mobility and other barriers many of these families face, identifying homes that have accessible features is a priority. Best practices emphasize that the important work of fair housing, marketing plans, outreach, community meetings, and tenant selection are critical to ensuring that these households are matched with the units that actually have the features they need. Finally, the city is leading the way in many directions. John mentioned the online system that they're using for some of their units. But there is no, and I echo exactly what John said, and we didn't talk in advance, there is no single online wait list for affordable housing units, and the application process often requires applicants or those working with them to go to various sites to complete the process. Just at Metro Housing, we have 70 different project-based developments for which we're administering vouchers. 37 of those have individual lists maintained by the owner. That's 37 different applications, 37 different places to go to apply for the housing. And families can't update their lists. So during the 10 years, or however long it is that it takes them to wait, when the application finally gets sent or the notice finally gets sent, letting them know that they've made the top of the list, when it's returned as undeliverable, they get dropped. There are many different steps that can be taken to help resolve some of the issues that have been raised. The standard application system online is one I've already mentioned. Here are 2 others. Hearings such as the one today allow you to ask specific questions, knowing what is built, where it's being built, and probably most important, at least for those of us here, who it's available to, i.e. what does affordable mean? Asking that next question is extremely important. Another step is to consistently reaffirm our commitment to fair housing. The city has a variety of segregation patterns of which we're all aware. One of the most valuable tools that we have to reduce some of that is the effective fair marketing plans. A major part of that process is to, in a timely fashion, monitor advertising and those meetings, the outreach, the application procedures to make sure that it's done in a non-discriminatory manner. The federal, state, and the local laws around this are extremely complicated, and as we heard from Sheila and her team, there's a large volume of housing under construction. This work needs to be done right. It needs to be done by qualified and trained people who know the fair housing rules, and Metro Housing appreciates that the administration is seeking to increase staff capacity to address this challenge and fully supports adequate funding to do so. Again, thank you for the opportunity to testify. I want to offer a blanket invitation to the entire council for any and all members to visit our new offices at Roxbury Crossing, to meet with our staff, and to talk to our clients at any time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Councilor, for inviting us to testify today. My name is Michael Kane. I'm the director of both the National Alliance of HUD Tenants and the Mass Alliance of HUD Tenants. Since 1983, we've organized tenants in privately owned HUD-subsidized housing. We count over 8,000 apartments in Boston that we've preserved as Section 8 affordable housing, but for the tenants' organization in those buildings. Prior to that, I was also instrumental in building the 10th City housing development in the South End over a period of years, which did not include federal subsidies. It had internally subsidized rent tiers, very similar to the IDP structure. And we were able to get a neighborhood preference for people displaced from the South End in that. So a lot of similarities to the IDP dilemmas that Sheila Dillon was talking about. I also worked as a consultant for the NAACP on the Boston CDBG case, which led to the consent decree in the 80s. We had not conferred about what we were going to recommend, but I was going to strongly recommend creating a single unified wait list for all of these properties. If you're a tenant or somebody who's homeless, and I should add, I am involved today with the Boston Homeless Solidarity Committee, and you're going to hear from somebody who shared her experiences of moving into the Avalon in the North End. But you know, there are a number of things that that experience shared. People have to go to every single property and sign up separately. That's a huge burden for people that are homeless or people that are in need of housing. It's also a burden to the developers. The developers have to maintain a completely separate process for each property with a huge volume of applications to go through. And a lot of them are the same people. A lot of them are the same people. So from the point of view of just efficiency and making it a streamlined process for people who are trying to get into housing and the developers, having a uniform wait list would make sense. Perhaps a city ordinance that could also address dilemmas like if your income goes up, you're forced out. Well, what's a uniform policy for that? What about internal transfers? That's an issue in existing HUD multifamily housing. If you need a different bedroom size at some point, are you given a preference over external applicants? There are questions like that that right now are up to the developers, which should be a uniform policy so that there is some uniformity to that. In the HUD multifamily world that we organize in, there's, you know, everybody has a long wait list. It's many years long, but there aren't a lot of vacancies. As soon as a vacancy comes up, people move in right away. So there are some lessons to be learned from that in looking at this new sector of IDP, privately owned housing. So I think a uniform process with perhaps an ordinance addressing these kinds of policy issues would make a lot of sense. But the other thing that really stands out when we look at these numbers reported by the city, the mayor's housing plan talked about 53,000 units between now and 2030. Of those units, and I think they're counting the new luxury or super luxury units toward that, the 2,200 that are in the pipeline, like the Millennium or the Dalton. Millennium apartments have opened, condos, or the Dalton, which is going to sell for an average of $6 million each for 160 condos. They're counting that toward the new production numbers. Well, there's far more of those units being built than there are units for very low-income people, who are the majority of the city. Majority of the residents of the city earn less than $50,000 a year. We heard from the city is saying that the IDP number is 70% of the AMI, which is 50,000. Well, that's above the average income for people in the city. So the total number which the city has put out of low-income units, very low-income units, is 422, they say. And I would like to question which are those units, what are the actual incomes of the people in those units, and what are the subsidy sources. The mayor's housing plan.
That again, Michael? Will you say that stat again?
I'm looking, this is in the order for today's hearing, and I've heard this from the city as well, that of the new low-income units, the city has permitted 422 units, 348 of which have been targeted to homeless individuals. I've heard that from other sources besides the ordinance, from the city. Recently I asked Devlin from the DND, how many of those were actually subsidized in the way that the mayor's housing plan said they would be subsidized, which is to take Section 8 vouchers from the BHA and convert them to project-based vouchers. The mayor's plan called for only 6,500 units of affordable housing for low and moderate income renters. That was out of that 53,000 for families, for non-elderly families. So the number was 6,500. Of those, 1,700 were supposed to be for very low income people. The 6,500 were intended to be tax credit units targeted to people below 60% of the area median income. The 1,700 were supposed to be extremely low income people earning less than 50, typically with a Section 8 subsidy, for example. Well, I asked him, in the mayor's plan, it said 1,700 units would be available for very low-income people by transferring vouchers from the BHA and converting them to project-based vouchers. That is a way to do it. But as of now, 0 units have, in fact, been converted from, according to Devlin, because why? Because the BHA's wait list has been frozen for the last few years, and there are no units being made available to the wait list of several, I mean, it was a 20-year wait list of the BHA. No units are turning over because of federal cutbacks and freezes. So as a result, there are no units available for project-based vouchers. So it's a question how these 422 units are allegedly being funded, subsidized, and what the actual income ranges are. It says they're claiming that many are from currently homeless people. It is possible you can be homeless and have an income above that level. There are many, I think you'll hear from somebody today who is one of those people. So we don't really know whether even these 422 apartments are actually available to the majority of residents of the city who need housing. We don't know that because the city hasn't really provided adequate information. But contrast that with the 2,200 pipeline units. The Millennium Building opened, 422 condos sold for $2.4 million each. And the Dalton is going to be $6 million each, 160 units. That's what's actually getting built in the city. And we would argue that that type of construction, that kind of priority, is actually raising rents in the neighborhoods nearby. The Dalton is not going to lower rents in the South End and Back Bay. Nobody believes that except perhaps a few people at the Department of Neighborhood Development. The construction that is underway in the mayor's housing plan, in our view, is actually making it worse in terms of raising rents to everybody else in the city, and there is not enough extremely low income or very low income housing that is being built under the mayor's plan. Now, we have proposed, as you know, a way to offset the fact that federal money is frozen. that there are no project-based vouchers available because the list is frozen, by supplementing that resource with a city rent subsidy, using the property tax revenues from places like Millennium Towers and the Dalton to target that revenue to low-income renters to offset the impact on the market that these luxury developments are creating. So we have proposed that to the council. We appreciate the council's 10 councilors that have supported that for the past few years. We were disappointed that the mayor did not include it in his budget yet again. But we have not given up on that idea. We, in fact, 50 of us showed up at the coffee hour in the North End a couple of weeks ago, and the mayor agreed to finally meet with us after not responding to our coalition request for the last 6 months. So we are expecting another meeting with the mayor. We're going to ask him to propose a supplemental budget request for at least the $5 million pilot that the council has proposed. We also would like to meet with the council about possibly an ordinance creating a program of that type, not funding it, but creating a program and enabling us to have a hearing where all the sides can come in and discuss it. We have gotten support from developers who think it's a great idea, and we suspect that a lot of the developers in the IDP housing would welcome that, because having a subsidy source for these units would also streamline and make it quicker and easier for them to fill the units with low-income people that meet the requirements. One of the difficulties is they have to seek a minimum and a maximum income for applicants, which makes it a lot harder and more burdensome for them to try to screen people. And a lot of people will fall through the cracks, so their income varies slightly 6 months later or a year later when they finally get called. So it makes it more burdensome for the developers. If there were a subsidy source that could be made available to make these units truly affordable to the people of Boston, then that would facilitate development and lower the vacancy rate, we believe. So we want to mention that. It's also come to our attention that the city of New York has a program called 1515, which is creating 15,000 units of low-income supportive housing from the city budget over the next 15 years. Exactly what we're proposing here, exactly what the city of Washington, D.C. does. So, and these would be permanent commitments of subsidies from the city budget, not just a one-time annual thing. So that's essentially what we wanted to share today. So thank you for inviting us.
Thank you. And anyone can feel free to, first of all, thank you for your advocacy and work in housing in general, and years, if not decades, commitment to making sure that this is an affordable city, that we are racially inclusive, and that we are a city where people can, of all incomes, can feel welcome. So I wanted to thank you all three of you, for your dedication to that. I just wanted to I'll throw out the questions and you guys can feel free to answer, whoever feels free, but I want to be clear about where you guys stand on the numbers in the city. Are you discounting them completely? Do you disagree with the fact that there are 103 units available right now for this lottery? I mean, I guess I wanted, because it seems like you were stating it was underreported.
I can answer only for my clients in my portfolio, where because those 100 properties, we have a de facto centralized wait list, because if you've applied to all 100 places and you send an update to one, you get updated on all the wait lists. Before they started using us, I had a number of clients in the 60% category who had 6 empty one-bedroom units or two-bedroom for 6 months, because it's a very difficult window to fill, and people in that category don't wait 3 years for an offer of housing. They just leave. They move out of town or they go somewhere else. In the 30 and 50%, you don't have that problem. There's 5,000 people on the list, and the landlord's there on Sunday night contacting the first 400 to see if they can find someone still on the list who's eligible and reachable. But absent that centralized list for affordable units, you're going to have those empty units, because the minute they started using our centralized, that went away, and now it's just a month and a half before they fill the unit. But most places, most management companies have to, because they operate in 22 states, their own wait lists. They're not centralized with the people in the buildings, the 100 buildings right next door. Mm-hmm. So that's one of those problems. And I can say that there is much more empty unit time in the 60% category than in the 30-50. I don't know about 70-80 because we don't deal with that because it's not affordable.
The 103.
I would agree that I think the city numbers are accurate. I also think there's a distinction between units ready for initial lease-up
Right.
versus turnover. And so on initial lease-up, we may not even be aware of those because they haven't come. That's in the purview of the city. I do know, for example, with our state vouchers, I can tell you that we have 668 allocated to Metro Housing, project-based. We have a 95% lease rate, meaning that we have 30 units that are sitting vacant right now. Those are all turnover units. And we have 130 additional units that are under construction that will come on, that are estimated to come on between May of 2018, which shows the differences in the development process, meaning it's still not online, and through March of 2019. So, we know that there are units under construction. We get the difference between the 800 versus the 100 that are ready today. But I think the questions that you've asked are key in terms of getting that list and being able to track it. So, for example, why didn't the development that was supposed to come on in May of 18 come on now that we're in August of 18?
But I guess I'm trying to make sure we're even talking about the same numbers, because if we're not, it's very hard to talk about the solutions. So what the numbers I understood is 103 ready to go that are people should be occupying shortly, or that they're going to push through. I completely agree with a standardized application so that one time a person with limited time, limited resources can just do it and it be submitted to all of them at once. But to me, then we're just setting up a long line for 103 units is what we have available. Are we agreeing on that, 103?
I have no total, I don't believe that's accurate, but I also believe it has, but I can't prove otherwise. I didn't come with that. I know that empty waitlist times, this turnover time, there's no one who can measure that right now.
Yeah, no, and I'm not talking
Okay,
about times. I'm talking about numbers of units.
Are these BPDA, IDP units you're talking about?
These are we were just talking about the vacant housing. Yes, IDP units that we are talking about, not BHA subsidized units. We're talking about the IDP units.
I have no input on that.
Okay, so because even with the solutions that you have so far in terms of streamlining the pipeline, we still hit this brick wall of 103 units that are available and thousands of people who need them. Another number also suggested or stated was there are 62 projects with about, he said 1,700, but really 1,300 units to come online, as in they're in various stages of being built. So I would think just add that to the 103. So now we're looking at about 1,400, maybe 1,500 units that might be ready to go, assuming they all get done at the same time. With the Streamline application process, we're still hitting a brick wall. I think we all agree there's just not enough units.
That's right.
Yes.
Another thing.
I think there aren't enough units. That's key in development is important. In terms of getting access to the units, though, and turning them around so you don't have units sitting vacant,
Right.
which is what I think you were getting to.
Yeah.
The comments that Sheila and her team made about adequate staffing,
Yes.
reviewing things promptly, and working with the developers so that you're holding those lotteries before the building is completed. I can say we just went through it. I know, we're in Councilor Janey's district, and we just opened our building where Metro Housing is located. There were 40 units of affordable housing on the top 3 floors of the building where our office is. And the developer was able to fill those units immediately upon completion of the process. But there are other delays in that, everything from coordinating fire and water and utilities and things to get the permitting. And there are tons of ways for delay. In fact, one solution or one opportunity for the council would even be to create a committee to look at those different areas where the delays happen and try to address those, because it's more than just the fair housing. That's the key element in the ones that have been brought to our attention. But there are numerous other parts of the system that cause lag or delay that prevent folks from being able to access those units timely.
Right. I think it's clear. I think the city should be commended for streamlining that one gap that was identified so that the lottery process is going forward early enough. But they didn't really say how many units remain vacant after the completion of the lottery process. It's something to perhaps ask them. But more importantly than that, let's say it is 1,400 units that are in the IDP pipeline. Only a small number of those are actually being targeted to very low-income people.
Right.
They're really targeting those to the people at 70% of the median, and as John is suggesting, they're not going to Boston residents. They're going to students. They're going to others at that very high end of the 60 and 70% income range. Just as an example, the Beverly had 239 affordable units. Of those, only 48 were actually made available to very low-income people. Somebody with a voucher, for example, who could move in, there were only 48 of those. So I think it's one thing to ask is the breakdown of the 103 units by income category. And what are the actual incomes of the people that are being selected? And how many of them are also homeless and being served in that way? We need to get those numbers, but it's really a drop in the bucket for what is going on out there. You can just walk out the building and see homeless people on the street.
I need to add one thing to that. It's really hard to talk about these empty units if they're not actually in affordable categories. I mean, you have to first clarify when you talk about affordable units if they are affordable. I will say this, though. Specifically, there's a major breakdown at the end of the lottery process. It's, as I think you'll hear from the management companies who are going to testify later, the process that Boston has done now, however streamlined it is completely disconnected from what the next steps that the management company has to do. Completely disconnected. It's really difficult to work with that lottery process and add people to your own wait lists. So we have to stop this. Affordable is, the word doesn't mean anything anymore. And there are major disconnects because people are standardizing and centralizing, but they're not talking about interconnectedness. They're not actually doing the work. They're setting policy, and it's wreaking havoc on the people who do the work. And the people setting that policy are not actually sitting and watching what it's like on the other end. Big announcement, but it's true.
And so in some of your, I think one of the biggest pushbacks I get when I talk about not being able to build our way out of this, or that we are assuming when we're building so much luxury with the hope that it will pay for affordable, what I would call trickle-down housing policy. When we're doing that, one of the biggest arguments is because we don't have money. The federal government has basically walked away and given up on its role or ability, or even, I guess, give a damn, about poor people being able to live with dignity in this country. And so, therefore, we are forced to look at the private market. Therefore, we're forced to work and to make sure that they have, that they're basically building as much as possible. What is your response to that?
There's a couple of solutions. There are properties building in the 30 and 60%, which I think of as the max of affordable in Boston. Often, Peabody Properties just put one up. Wynn Residential just put one up. They're small, and they're not downtown. That's one solution, is that when it's a large development, I will blame the BPDA for this. They cede entirely with the developer, and there are no affordable units. The second thing is, the building I live in has a full spectrum of mixed income. Extremely low income up to market. The market helped pay for the other categories. It's a fabulous exponential build of social capital. So these buildings that are being built need to not just have market units and a little bit of 70%. They need to have 30, 50, 60, 70, and market in the same building. And they need to be required to do that. That makes it affordable. It just means that the owners make less money. There's plenty of money on their end. When they say they can't afford it, that's a lie.
I also disagree, but for a different reason. I find it interesting that when it comes to serving the families that we work with, that they get the leftovers and we can't build our way out. There are fewer extremely low-income households in the city than there are middle-income households. But somehow, because it costs less, we can afford to build our way out of the problem of middle-income housing. We can create lots of housing for middle income, but it's a question of resources, it's a question of prioritization and how the money gets spent. And that's, again, back to my first solution of having those questions that get asked. And don't stop when you hear affordable housing. Ask the next question until you're satisfied. If you look back when Governor Romney was in, they released a report on homelessness. At the time, the shelter capacity, the emergency assistance shelter capacity for the Commonwealth stood at 900 families statewide. And they had to issue reports because they were decrying the homelessness crisis. Today, 28 years, do my math, 18, whatever it is, years later, 18 years later, the shelter capacity is at 3,500 families across the Commonwealth tonight. That's after 18 years of building tons of affordable housing. We're doing something wrong, and no one's calling people on it, and no one's going back to actually look at real solutions. Instead, we have things like the zoning bill that's pending before the legislature that calls for 135,000 new units of housing with no mention of affordability in it.
So, there is a potential source. The positive side of all the luxury development is that is generating a huge amount of new property tax revenue to the city. The Millennium Building that opened at the old Filene site, 442 condos that sold for an average of $2.4 million. The property tax revenue received from that building in the first year is going to be $10.9 million. That's going to be a permanent stream of income to the city. If anything, it will only go up if the values increase. So 10.9 million is enough to subsidize 1,000 very low income families in tax credit buildings. The 6,500 tax credit units that the city says they want to build for families, that could be the source for the very low income units in lieu of project-based vouchers from the BHA, which are not available because of federal cutbacks. So it's a new, just look up in Boston, there's this incredible new wealth that is being generated by the city's support for these luxury developments. We just need to make sure the revenue from those is being used to offset the negative impacts on housing, on rental housing in the city. It works out that for every $1 million in a condo value, the owner is paying $10,400 for property taxes for that $1 million. So that's enough for a very low income subsidy in a tax credit unit. It's enough for a very low income person, and that's a permanent rental stream. Now, last year the city had new revenue of $170 million. So the city budget is now $3.3 billion. Assuming that the new revenue increases each year in that range, $170 million, it's not too much to ask that a small portion of that new revenue be allocated by the city for a low-income rent subsidy program, like New York is doing, like Seattle is now doing, like Washington, D.C. is doing. Just set aside, the mayor can do this.
We're going to let him,
We're going to get $170 million a year.
Councilor Baker,
sorry?
we're just going to let him finish, and then
It's new revenue coming to the city. Now, there's a lot of other claims in that revenue, police, fire, schools, and so on. But one of the things that it can be used for is a housing rental subsidy, operating subsidy. When they talk about affordable housing, almost all the programs that the city and state has put forward are capital subsidies. They lower the cost of construction or purchase of those buildings. That's helpful, but even if you gave the buildings away, very low-income people cannot afford the operating costs without some form of operating subsidy. That's the reality. So you need to have some kind of operating subsidy, whether it's Section 8 vouchers that are set aside for that building, or the state MRVP program, or a city subsidy that would supplement that. You have to have some kind of low-income rent subsidy for low-income renters to be able to afford to live in either new housing or to preserve buildings like the 13A buildings that are being lost, or the new mixed-income public housing buildings. They need an operating subsidy for those low-income renters. So we're just saying, when looking at the new revenue, dividing up the pie, let's say that housing is an important priority, just like education and schools and fire. It should be a recognized use of the city's budget, and this is one way to do it.
Can I add one more sentence? In talking about the priority of using this money, the Housing First model applies here. You have to have housing before you can do the schools, the education, the healthcare. It's the #1 case management issue across the spectrum. Charles Dickens wrote about it in that preface to Oliver Twist. And the lesson he wrote in there is, if you don't do housing first, it doesn't just burden the homeless, it tears apart the entire city.
Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and turn over to Councilor Essaibi-George.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your questions. A lot of my questions have been answered already, so I appreciate your thoroughness. What is related a little bit? What's the value that we need those MRVPs to be in order for them to be competitive in this market?
The MRVPs, you want to take that?
The vouchers.
Oh, the voucher.
Yeah.
Well, I can say that the current vouchers payment standard of the Boston Housing Authority, 110%,
Yeah.
is limited by statute, is insufficient to cover the rents in almost all of the city at this point. The MBHP pays 120%. They can go higher because the state program that they are part of is a state is a moving to work agency, so they can go above that. But and Chris should really respond to this. But
That's on the Section 8 program. On the state program, vouchers, if I get this right, Steve, 2005? The last time the state adjusted their rent levels for the mass rental voucher program was 2005. Those are the rent levels that we're allowed to pay using the state program unless we get a waiver. To give credit where credit is due, DHCD is granting most waivers, but those waivers take time. So you have an owner, on one hand, that can go rent in the private market, given where things are, or they can wait while we, A, negotiate them down from the rent that they want, and then tell them when they settle on a rent that we have to go get a waiver from the state. But please hold this unit for our family that's waiting for housing. So at a minimum, moving the fair market rent on MRVP to the current fair market rents would save time and allow to make it more useful for families.
But it won't be, the project-based program, the project-based Section 8 program allows owners to get up to the actual market rent for their properties. And I can tell you that in the South End and Fenway areas, the HUD is currently paying $2,600 for a one-bedroom apartment to those landlords, and now it's up to $3,000 for two-bedroom apartments. So if you have a Section 8 voucher, forget about trying to find an apartment at that. That's what the rents are in the community. The voucher has a limit. So you cannot use it. In increasing, really at this point, I don't think there's any neighborhood in Boston where, unless the building had some other subsidy like Georgetown, right, where the Section 8 voucher can be used. So people, therefore, if they can't find a place, they give up the voucher, or they have to move out of town to Brockton or Fall River, or, up in the North Shore. So that is an issue, that the units, and certainly the MRVP program at its current payment standard is completely useless in Boston.
Great. I actually don't have any other questions. Thank you.
Councilor Baker?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chris, I think it's your name. Can you talk to me about the 40 units that were above you? The minute that they were done, they were occupied, or not the minute?
Sure.
But,
Yeah.
like, so what did that developer do right, and how did that happen?
They were ahead of, they were ahead of the game in terms of their marketing plans, submitting the materials to the city, getting everything approved in advance, and then as soon as they had a date, and this is where I got back to the idea of streamlining things such as the permitting or the inspections and getting groups in the ground at the same time, as far as utilities, that once they had a date that they knew they were going to be ready to open, they were able to hold the lottery in advance, get that lined up, and then move people in.
And who was that developer?
Mission Hill Neighborhood Housing Services was the developer of the property at Roxbury Crossing on parcel 25.
And was it just 40 units there? Is that the entire housing component?
That was the entire housing component of that specific development, yes.
Okay, thank you. Michael, will you talk a little bit about the New York City 15 for 15? Do you know any details on that? So is the city using city funds to build buildings that they will operate, or are they turning them over at some point? Do you know how that is working?
What I know about it is and we just learned about it recently from a local developer, Trinity Financial told us about it. They have capital sources for supportive housing that are both city and state, but they are supplementing it with an operating subsidy, as I suggested they will need. And my understanding is it's from the city budget. It's subject to annual appropriation. So they make a 15-year commitment, just like a federal Section 8 contract, but it's subject to annual appropriation by the City of New York through the Office of Management and Budget.
So the city of New York is just, they're putting in the operating budget for
that's our understanding.
and the developer is building it themselves?
Well, the developer is also getting subsidies from the capital, like, rehab or new construction subsidies from a variety of sources that are supportive housing programs. And it's called 15 for 15 because their goal is to build 15,000 new units over the next 15 years.
Yeah, so it's
it's a
not
new
like
program.
the city is taking 100% of that burden there.
Right, and it's targeting homeless people. There's a huge problem of homelessness in New York. New York's a much larger budget, but they're committing that money.
And when you say New York, would that be Manhattan or is it Staten Island or?
The city of New York.
Okay.
So it's what is it, 7 boroughs or?
Five.
Five boroughs. Thank you. Thank you, Lydia.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Counselor Janey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to this panel, Chris, the work that you're doing certainly, and Michael. I'm a big fan of using the revenue from the luxury condos to really think about moving forward with this city-funded rent subsidy. So I'm really excited. I'm hoping you can give us some more detail. You just mentioned earlier the Millennium Building where the average condos were selling for 4.2?
The average sale price was 2.4.
2.4.
For 442 condos.
Yeah, and just that building alone, $10.9 million. If we did that across the city, do you have figures there that you'd like to share with us?
Yes, the city says there are 2,200 super luxury condos. Forget about affordable housing. This is super luxury condos, like the Dalton, like that one, like the new Millennium Building that is about to be built, that are in the pipeline. And they're going up in every neighborhood.
Yep.
So look at the South End and the Ink Block area, the parts of Brighton. There are all these super luxury condos that are in the Fenway, that 99-unit building that was sold to Chinese investors.
So do you have any projections in terms of revenue, in terms of tax, property tax?
Well, if the Dalton's, the Millennium was 2.4 million average. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that these 2,200 units will sell for an average of 2 million plus. I think that's a safe bet. That is enough money at $10,000 per year for each million. That's enough money to subsidize 4,000 to 5,000 low-income rental apartments in a permanent basis. Housing first to get homeless people off the street, but also enough to it could solve the 13A problem for the 600 families that are facing displacement. It would be you could probably double the number of low-income units in the J.P. Rocks plan, because the one-third formula are minimums, right? So you could make additional low-income rent subsidies available to make those units more affordable to the community. Or the public housing developments. That's a source that could be used to help with the Bunker Hill renovation as a low-income subsidy source for those renters. So it's 4,000 to 5,000 would have a substantial impact on the city.
Right.
And that would be over the next 4 years. This is new revenue over the next 4 years. We are not saying that all we're just saying take a portion of the new revenue from the condo developments, just the ones that are super luxury.
Right, and so the portion is what? Just so that we're clear, to get to the 4,000 to 5,000 subsidized units using the 2,200 super luxury condos, what portion of that revenue are you talking about?
Just
those
super luxury
alone,
condos,
just
but
those, all of those.
They're building other condos, right? I mean, the 53,000, a lot of the other units in the 53,000 target are market rate developments. Some of it they call workforce housing, but it's really market rate housing. So we need a real breakdown of what supermarket above the market, outside of anybody who lives here, and then the market for the people, some people who do live here, and then the affordable need, which is the majority of the residents. Take a look at the actual numbers of the incomes of the people for those units. But there's the revenue just from the property tax revenue from just those units will be coming into the city over the next few years.
Yep, and how much, again, per year do you anticipate?
Well, if the city, I'm not, we need to ask the city what they project from the new development, but it was 107, I believe 170 million last year was the increment in new revenues, mostly property taxes from the new development.
Of that 170, though, how much was just the super luxury?
Well, it was, the only one I know is the 10 million. 10 million of that was from Millennium.
Right. Well, I certainly, again,
10.9 million.
I'm a fan. I think this is an opportunity to really make sure that we're finding the good, as you say, as this market kind of goes out of control, that we use that revenue to offset, what is happening in our neighborhoods. The other thing I just wanted to quickly mention is the importance of really streamlining the application process and the wait list. So I've been working with a family now, I would say over a year, before I even got to the council, currently in a building that has some sort of subsidy. It's a one-bedroom apartment. Things have changed since moving into the one-bedroom apartment. This is an immigrant family who now has, the rest of the family has joined them here, and so it's literally 4 people living in the one-bedroom. Application at this site and sites all across the city, filling in, and there's, language barriers, so literally having to fill in multiple applications. It is just daunting for this family. And then the only kind of communication you get back is perhaps you get a letter saying that you're X number on a wait list. You get that months later.
Right.
Maybe a couple years after that, you get another letter saying you're still on the wait list. Respond back so that we keep you on the wait list. God forbid you don't respond back, you get dropped. I mean, it's just, it's a nightmare for families. And meanwhile, there are 4 people crammed into a one-bedroom apartment. And there's got to be a better way. There has to be a better way.
We heard at the Homeless Solidarity meeting last Sunday from Jeannie Shirley, who's here today, who was homeless. And when she got on the wait list for the Avalon, there was a problem about first, last, and security deposit. And she needed to get that from the RAFT or home base program. And that there's a bureaucracy there, and the timing of that can also get in the way of somebody being able to accept the unit at the right moment, which is a factor of making, that may be another factor in the vacancies and the issues that needs to be looked at to streamline that process so that it interfaces with people who are homeless or just low income and need a subsidy to get into the IDP units.
Councilor, may I add something about this streamlined application process? Because you've got so many players who operate in multi-states, it's a really sticky issue what that means. But there are certainly some practical things. I mean, you just can't make Wynn and Peabody use the same application, and if their funding source is a different federal agency, they can't use the same application. But you could have, first of all, a single application process. Housing Works is a model where you input your data and then it generates all the different applications, mostly filled out for you, so that you can locate everything and apply to it. And you overcome a fair housing barrier, because if your advocate is Chinese American and you don't speak American, she does, and she can handle a couple hundred families with our system. But you could certainly, jawbone management companies to implement a one-page preliminary app instead of the 30-page application some of them do, which they do to discourage garbage applications right now. And then once the person comes to the top of the list in 5 years, they can fill out the 30-page application. And there's one issue, this home base issue. This is one of the causes of vacancy. The shelters are desperate. They don't have a forwarding mechanism, so if I apply from a shelter and 6 months later I get a letter saying we put you on the list, I'm not at that shelter anymore and the shelter doesn't forward my mail. So you could get the shelters to institute a forwarding system to at least reach people. Right now, maybe we do 42,000 updates a year on one wait list because people change their circumstances multiple times. That's a lot of work, and most of those people won't move in. But then you've got the home-based issue. The shelters are forcing people into affordable units, and they can't afford them after the year, so they get evicted, and then maybe they're not eligible for services anymore. That's causing vacancies because on your list, if only 1 out of every 300 people is actually reachable and eligible, it takes a long time to fill a unit. That's several things all at once, sorry. But there are ways to make this work despite the politics and the economics.
So before we go to Councillor Campbell, we have someone who specifically asked you to medical necessity to testify very briefly. So we have, if you want to testify for about the mic over there is fine. Ms. Olivia Martin, for about no more than 2 minutes.
I won't take that long. Hi. Good afternoon to everybody. My name is Olivia Martin. As of last Wednesday, I was homeless. I live in the South End. I was raised there in the South End. During the Sinhai program, I seen every development go up from Langham Court, Tent City, Roxy Home. I was a property owner who had a 5-story building. After I completely rehabbed the building that I bought for $130,000, they sold my mortgage, and they made $1.5 million off of my work. I moved into public housing. Thought I was going to be there for 5 years. Everything that I've earned and had since I was 9 years old has walked out of public housing, and my apartment has never been broken into. They moved me into a 2-bedroom apartment, 16 years. Then they evicted me, saying I refused to transfer. The apartment building that I live in is 12 units. Every apartment in that building is 2 bedrooms, 1 person in each one. I've watched in the development that I live 4 bedrooms over and over be held for 9 months until they decided who they wanted to move into those apartments. I know seniors right now who are living in 2 bedrooms apartment. The development that I lived in, right now, my furniture has a roof over its head, and I've been walking the streets for the last 5 nights because I don't have a place to sleep. When BHA and BHP was in partnership, they gave me a voucher. BHA won't record my disability because they don't want to accommodate me. I have seen the times that I have seen over and over people who are working a 40-hour job, brand new cars, park at visitors parking, park at the meters. One woman they used to testify against me right now today, since 2014, she has been subletting her apartment. I brought this to management. They picked through my documents to evict me. One woman, she's 73, qualified a long time ago for senior housing, has a 2-bedroom. They've already noted that nobody lives with her. The building that I was priced and pushed out, everybody in that building should be out, because everybody in that building, as they accused me, my child went into the Marines in 1999. For 4 years, from 2000 to 2005. They charged me rent for my child, and my child has never lived in housing. He was in Iraq for this country. People who are working 40 hours a job, who are not on people lease, are living there. Go from Back Bay down Dartmouth Street, cross over to Harrison, to West Newt, come back around, count those cars. The city doesn't cross-check their parking permits with the developers. I got an MBHP voucher under this hand. I can't even afford to stay in the South End. And with the MBHP voucher, the very person who's evicted me under this hand is taking it. How does it happen? I'm in the street and you give my furniture a place to sleep. You've got more apartments. They're not overcrowded. They're saving these apartments for their family. Their grandfathering them in that says if you turn 18 and you're on your parents' lease, you are qualified to get an apartment. But they're not doing that. Those 4-bedroom apartments that was vacant from April to December was their family, their friends. You need to check out Villa Victoria. No disrespect, you need to check out Cathedral. I'm talking what I know.
Thank you.
I gotta go, but I'm still in the street. Why do my furniture have a place to sleep?
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Martin. Counselor Campbell?
Thank you, Ms. Martin, and thank you, Counselor Edwards, for letting Ms. Martin testify. I think, well, frankly, after Ms. Martin's testimony, I mean, as someone who grew up in Roxbury, and frankly, and the South End, I know exactly what she's talking about. I go back, I grew up on 560 Mass Ave, which was an affordable housing unit run by TDC when I was a kid. And it's obviously the neighborhood looks very different. And at the time, there were folks who were looking at where the city was going and trying to think of creative ways, knowing where particularly the South End was going, to come together and buy some of these buildings to preserve them, more of them, for affordable housing units. I mean, units that are truly affordable for families who are living there and also our seniors. So I just had to sort of pause for a minute there. So I think we all hear these stories and know the struggle. I just want to thank you guys for your testimony. I think it highlights that we have a lot of work to do. It highlights, I think, some of the questions we need to continue to ask. Some of these questions we asked during the budget season, and Michael in particular, when it comes to the housing vouchers in that program, fully support it, was frankly very upset that it wasn't included in the last budget, because I agree with you. There's adequate resources for it to exist, and I don't think it's much to ask to take that away from the new revenue to apply it there. And I said it, don't give it to BPS, and I said it loud and clear. I think there's so many different needs, so how do we weigh what our schools need and, of course, what all the other departments need, including those who are trying to combat the displacement issue when it comes to the new development. So thank you for your work. I'll continue to work with you. I think just following up on something you said related to the ordinance and the hearing piece, I think we've had a lot of conversations, including under the leadership of Councilor Edwards, of Councilor Zachem, hearings, conversations, and wanting to do not just an ordinance, but making sure there's funding to support what we're trying to do through an ordinance. And that has to be a joint effort between the administration and the council. So making sure that we do that. So keep us abreast of your conversations with the administration and how we can, from our side, support you in those efforts. I look forward to reviewing the up-to-date data from D&D and the administration and also the BPDA on the units we were talking about today. What are those units? Where are they being built? Who are they meant to serve? Where are they going? I think it's such a complex conversation that I think we need that data. I mean, I know the report doesn't spell it all, And I think you guys allude to that. Some of the reports we put out don't pull it apart in such a way that it really gets to what we're trying to talk about, really addresses the need, so that we're all on the same page as to what that is. And then, of course, what we need to be creating to address the need. So I look forward to following up with you guys, including with some of my colleagues, based on the data that they will submit to us. But just wanted to thank you guys for being here and for the work that you do every day. I'm sure it's extremely difficult, because I'm sure you see folks like Ms. Martin all the time. We do, but I'm sure you see more of Ms. Martin's. So thank you.
Thank you. So at this point, we're going to move to public testimony. Oh, I'm sorry, we have one more panel, excuse me. That would include Brian Engler from SEB Housing and Tammy Polson from Peabody Properties. Thank you. Go ahead.
Hello, I'm Brian Engler. I'm from SEB Housing. I'm the principal there. I've been involved in affordable housing in Massachusetts for 15 years. I've been hired by dozens of different developers in the city of Boston alone. I've worked on a few dozen affordable housing lotteries. I think we're pretty uniquely positioned in that we work at the intersection of the bureaucracy of BPDA, Boston Fair Housing, and the private sector, which is working with the developers and working with the applicants and filling the units. So I brought a schedule here, which is kind of highlights the best case scenario and how long it takes to lease these units or get them occupied. You were asking earlier, after the representatives from the BPDA and D&D were here, and you were saying, after everything that you're saying, I still don't understand how it takes 2 years to fill these units. And this is basically laid out in the schedule that I have here. They are taking actions, but the main issues from our standpoint in getting these units filled are, one, up until a few weeks ago, it takes 4 to 8 months to get a marketing plan approved. So when Mr. Baker was asking about South Bay, that's one of my clients, and we submitted that marketing plan in October of last year, and we still don't have approval on that. And we've received some very basic comments on it, which we turned around and submitted the day after within 24 hours, and we still don't have approval on that. And so the office that was reviewing those, they work really, really hard to turn those around, and they work really late, but they have 1.5 people working there, and when they need to have 7. So that's a big issue. You can shave 4 to 8 months off the process right there just by making the review of the marketing plan more efficient. After that, once marketing starts, it's a pretty regimented process. There's not that many inefficiencies. You could shave off a week or a month here and there, and I could go into that. That's more fine-tooth refinement. But because from when you start, when you get approval to market until really you actually run the lottery, it's going to be about 4 months. We do a lot of 40B work. We've been involved in a few hundred different developments in the suburbs of Massachusetts. 4 months from the start of marketing to when you have a lottery list and households that you can turn over to the waiting list or to the leasing office isn't that ridiculous. Trying to truncate that when you're dealing with thousands and thousands of applicants, I don't think that's where the focus really should be. So the issue is, after we have We run the lottery. We turn the waiting lists over to the management companies. They start screening households. Where households come in, they have to complete a lease application just like anywhere else, and they get approved. That's when we come back in and they notify us, because we're experts in certifying households as doing the income and asset verifications for those households. They notify us that a household has reserved a unit. We work with that household directly to get the BPDA affidavit of eligibility together and submit it to the BPDA. And there it takes 4 to 8 weeks for them to approve that or review that. And that's a lot of time for an applicant who has a unit reserved, is really anxious to get into an affordable unit, and doesn't know when they're going to be approved. And it's also unclear for us if it's going to take 2 weeks or if it's going to take 8 weeks. There's no written guidelines that the BPDA follows, unlike HUD, the Chapter 5 guidelines on what counts as income and what doesn't count as income. And so sometimes, even though we've done hundreds and hundreds of these, we'll submit a file and the BPDA will say, that there's one piece of documentation missing, and they want to see that piece of documentation. In addition, they want the applicant, because it's been 8 weeks since that file was submitted, they want everything else resubmitted. So it puts this undue burden on the applicants to kind of scramble around while they're in this limbo waiting for housing. So I think that you could, if you focus a little resources on how long it takes the BPDA to review the files, that would make a huge improvement. So instead of 4 to 8 weeks, maybe it's 1 to 3 weeks. I could tell you my office, with the staff that I have, if we were in that office and we were just being sent applications directly from properties and not even dealing with the applicants themselves, we could turn those around in a week or two, and it's taking 8 weeks. And again, that's because they're understaffed as well. And then there's a new issue that's coming up right now, which is that when we submit our marketing plans to Boston Fair Housing, we try to make them as transparent as possible. So we put all the details together about what the transition is like from when we notify the property and notify the applicant, and how long it's going to take them to, how long their property is going to give them to put a deposit down and sign a lease and everything else. Until recently, the city has said the property can use their standard policies. So if and in some cases, we have to discourage the property from doing that, because on the market rate side, a lot of these properties, when they have a certified household or somebody comes in to lease one of those $3,000 a month apartments that's not part of the program, and they complete the lease application, the property says, okay, congratulations, you need to give us your deposit right now or within 48 hours, and you have to move into that unit within a week or 10 days or sometimes a little bit longer. Right now, and we tell the property, you got to give applicants at least 30 days. We've always told them that, because if you turn around and tell them that they have to move in right away, that applicant's just going to walk, because that applicant hasn't put a deposit down or anything else. And what that means is, so the properties, with our encouragement, have been given households 30 days to move in. The city has recently told us, and this is a new policy, so it hasn't even manifested itself, but I can tell you how it's going to manifest, is that they're saying that applicants need to be given at least 30 days from the date of certification to put a deposit down, and that those households need to be given 60 days from the date that they've put that deposit down and signed a lease to actually move in. And what that does is, at the very end of this process, it adds an additional 90 days onto the process. And what happens is, not every household who gets certified and has reserved a unit, and keep in mind, when that unit's been reserved, it's been reserved for months because they're waiting for BPDA certification and everything else. Every time a household doesn't reserve that unit, if they get certified and they wait 30 days and then they tell the property, I'm no longer interested, that unit then gets added back to the inventory, and now it's going to take another 3 or 4 months to fill that unit. And so what you're going to end up with is what we have at some of the properties that I'm working at right now, via Benjamin, that have 50 affordable units. It's going to take them an extra 6 months to fill vacant units that are right there. And so I put in the back of this some of the suggestions that I have. The BPDA and Boston Fair Housing probably roll their eyes, because I've been talking about this stuff to them for 3 and 4 years. But there's been little change. I'd also just note that right now I'm involved in 6 different properties that have 190 affordable units that are going to be coming online before they will be occupied. So that's not part of that 103. There's 190 units where we either just got approval on the marketing plan or we're still waiting for it, like at South Bay, and those units are going to be coming online sometime in early 2019. Some of them are coming online in a month or two. And the way that this process shakes out, households will not be moving. If we got approval today for South Bay, households wouldn't be able to move into those units until maybe March, April, or May of next year, just because of the timeline that I have here. So there's a lot of other units that aren't part of that, 103 that they're saying. But so there's there's a lot of other issues too with the city, or not with the city, but with the program. I don't want to take up too much time. I mean, I can defer to you. I mean, I'm sure you have a lot to say as well. But real quickly, I will say that a major concern for me is that you want to talk about households being rent burdened. Right now, the city doesn't really have a very clear definition of what rent burden is, and they defer to what the management company uses to qualify households for market rate units. So if a management company says a household has to make 3 times the rent, and they have somebody apply for a $3,000 a month apartment, that household has to make roughly $9,000 a month, and they can apply that same standard to somebody who's applying for a $1,000 a month apartment. What's happening, though, is you have national management companies and developers coming into Boston, and some of these have gone to a no rent-to-income ratio check. They do credit only. So if you have a household who wants to lease a $1,500 a month affordable apartment, and they only make $1,000 a month, but they have good credit, they will get approved. And we all know that a household that's making $1,000 a month cannot afford rent that's $1,500 a month. And there should be some standard in place that prevents management companies from, and management companies, and the issue with this is management companies can't impose a requirement on the affordable applicants that's more stringent or stricter than their market rate policies. Right. So if a management company has a policy for the market rate units that there is no rent to income ratio, or that households just have to make the monthly rent, they have to apply that to the affordable tenants. Whereas if there was a requirement from the city that they couldn't, approve a household who wasn't making at least twice the rent, they would be able to defer to that. And by I know the city's overburdened with a lot of the regulations and a lot of the tasks at hand, but to kind of overlook that potential problem is, just think it's a great oversight, because it is going to be a potential problem.
So we're going to go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Tammy Polson. I am the Director of Compliance for Peabody Properties. Peabody's been involved with providing affordable housing for 45 years in the state of Massachusetts, either through development, marketing, and of course management. I have a lot I could say. I was really hoping that the individuals from BPDA and D&D would be here, because there's some things I think they need to hear. I think some of the information that's fed to them is very one-sided, and so they don't see the big picture of things that are going on behind the scenes. So it's unfortunate that they're not here to hear this. So I will try and keep this brief.
You do have someone here from D&D.
Oh,
that's Bob Gerhardt. Mr. Gerhardt, right there.
Oh, hi there. Thank you. So because it's getting late and I want to make sure that there's time for the public to speak as well, I'm just going to hit on one area that I think is my biggest concern. I'm going to talk about the lottery process and how it works. Currently, there are two processes in effect. One is through Boston Fair Housing Commission, which is part of D&D BDP, and Mass Housing. So I'm going to go over the Boston Fair Housing, which has been given to us. So as of 2018, basically, again, the first thing we do is we have to submit an ad to them for them to review. They have 2 business days, 2 weeks in which to review that data and give us either an approval or come back with us with some requested corrections. If there's any errors in that ad, you have to resubmit it, and that whole 2-week process starts all over again. I just had that happen on a property that we're actually trying to get off the ground in Dorchester. It's called Harmon Apartments. It's a great property. We're really, really excited about it, but there's been multiple delays in getting this off the ground. We just found out today, again, that we're having some issues with the lottery itself and the application list, so we're having to resubmit that now for the 3rd time. That's added a month to this whole process. But let me get back to the process. So it's 2 weeks for them to review the ad. Once it's approved, we have 2 weeks to continue with the outreach and the marketing of the property. Then there's 4 weeks. They said earlier 2 weeks, but there's actually 4 weeks of the application process that is open to both online applicants as well as those who prefer to submit paper applications. For an additional 1.5 weeks, we need to follow up with paper applications or allow for those paper applications to come into our office for those who have sent them via the mail, because there's a deadline date in which everyone gets that in. So to be fair, we wait for an additional 4 or 5 days to make sure that all of those come in. With the manual applications, we're required to take all of that data and then transfer it onto a spreadsheet. The application itself has become extremely long. A lottery application should contain very minimal information for a household. This particular application that they have basically has 60+ questions on there, and all of that data gets transferred on this application. So when a paper application comes in, we now have to enter all of that data on the spreadsheet. It is extremely time-consuming to do all of that. Not only that, the spreadsheet that they have doesn't necessarily work, so you have to make modifications to that and actually transfer all of that data over to another spreadsheet, which means that the process that's currently in effect doesn't even work. And before they rolled it out, they should have assured that it was working, because now we have the burden of correcting it and making it work on their behalf. So after the paper applications and whatnot are received, then of course it all goes back to the Boston Fair Housing Commission to again, they have 2 weeks to review all of the data. If there's any corrections, and I guarantee you there will always be corrections. Again, when you've received 2,500 applications, there's going to be something that we might oversee, or we don't catch, excuse me. We have 3 different eyes looking at it at any given time, trying to make sure that we're as efficient as we possibly can be, but ultimately when we get it sent to them, they're going to send it back with some additional corrections. Some of those, I believe, are just inconsistencies and they don't understand. And the biggest issue I have, and I think Brian can relate based on what he just said with some of these other requirements, is they're very reactive. They're not proactive. If you let us know in advance exactly what you're looking for and what you need, we will make sure we abide by that. We've been in business for 45 years. We have DHCD and mass housing coming to us all the time asking for us to take over properties that are struggling because owners or managers are not properly doing their job, and they ask us to step in and take over. We know what we're doing. We're really good at what we do, and that's what we're asking them to do, is allow us to do our job. So after they've reviewed the applications logs and they finally approve them, then they can actually schedule the lottery. That takes about an additional 1.5 weeks. One, they schedule it, so it's based on their availability on when they can actually hold it. And then, of course, we have to notify all the applicants that the lottery is going to be held, so we have to send out letters or emails to everyone to advise them of the date, time, and the location. At the conclusion of the lottery, and depending upon the number of preferences and the complexity of the sort, it could take an additional 3 to 4 days for us on the management side to actually do that sort. Again, it's very, very cumbersome. There's a lot involved. We want to make sure we don't miss anyone or put somebody, in a category that they don't belong. And then we're done with that. It actually takes an additional 2 weeks for Boston Fair Housing to review and approve that. I have not been through that process with them yet. We're going through our very first project with them right now. We're still waiting to actually get the lottery scheduled because we're still waiting on the applicant log, so we'll see how that process goes. Basically, the process is taking over 15+ weeks before we can actually start interviewing applicants, processing their files, and offer them a place to call home. Keeping in mind the 15 weeks assumes a smooth process and that there are no corrections required at any time during this process, which again is going to be nearly impossible. The second approach is through DHCD and mass housing. After approval of the Affirmative for Housing Marketing and Tenant Selections Plans, which are typically done way in advance, we have some that we've worked on, a year in advance, a year and a half in advance. It's something that's been in the works for a long time because we do have developers, and with our help, we provide that information early on in the process. But the difference is they rely upon and trust us to carry out all requirements of the plan. There's no active participation and no monitoring at any time during the process. The process has been in practice for several years with minimal to no adverse effects. From the start of the outreach to the conclusion of the lottery sort, the timeline is approximately 10 weeks. A significant difference between the way they handle theirs and the way that Boston Fair Housing does. During my discussion today, I've identified at least one area of inefficiency we are experiencing with that process. It is clear to me that they believe passionately in what they do and provide a valuable service to our city. My intent is not to demean or depreciate their efforts, but to bring to the surface processes that are currently inefficient but could be improved with a few adjustments. The Boston Fair Housing Commission went from being an agency whose responsibility was to eliminate discrimination and increase access to housing through investigation enforcement, has turned into micromanaging the business side of the process without regard to how it impacts the developers, owner agents, and ultimately the people who are urgently trying to find housing. For without all, there would be no housing to provide. There needs to be a level of trust in the people who are trying to carry out the policies and procedures that have been established and allow us to do our job without intervention. Mistakes will happen, things will sometimes be overlooked, but it is never malicious or intentional and usually always correctable. In order to get through the red tape and delays we are currently experiencing, I am recommending a committee be formed that includes individuals from all phases of the affordable housing process, including city and agency officials, developers, owners, and management agents, to discuss possible revisions to streamline the process and to make it less cumbersome for all, yet maintaining the integrity of the programs and the process. Thank you. On a side note, in listening to all the discussion, there's been a lot of talk about offering additional 60% units. I can honestly tell you, we actually struggle to fill the 60% units. Either people are under the minimum income requirements, and we do have a minimum rent-to-income ratio because we are looking out for the benefit of the individuals that are living there. And either they're below or they're way over. There is a significant need for housing closer to the 50% AMI range. Most of the lotteries, you've got 30% and then you have your 60. And when we're looking at the minimum income, a lot of them are over 40, or excuse me, over 30, but they don't make enough for the 60. So there's a large gap of people that we're not able to house. So if we try to work with the developers to getting that AMI and getting some more of those 50% units, we would be doing a huge service to everyone out there.
Thank you. Thank you both. I just had some general questions about, so I worked at the Office of Housing Stability, and working with developers is one of the things we had to do to help get the Metro list up and running. Mm-hmm. I remember being incredibly frustrated at the call to them to come to the table and submit. They were supposed to actually submit their affordable units to us to make sure that we were out there pushing those units. And when we called a meeting for all 15 of the major developers in Boston, I think Peabody, Avalon, so on and so forth, only two actually showed up to actually be a partner with the city. So I just want to be very clear. Mm-hmm. There's improvements on both sides. Developers, maybe it's due to the lack of trust, but certainly when the city has called for you to be at the table, at least when I was running the department, they did not show up to help with Metro List, which is Metro List, again, is a result of a lawsuit of the city of Boston because the units were not put out uniformly based on racial issues. So that was happening again with the developers, not helpful. And if not, also playing into the same racial segregation that has haunted our city. So I want to be very clear. I'm not here trying to also pick you apart, but in as much as there are hands that are involved in the making availability of units, it's many powerful hands with a lot of money on both sides, private and public, who are guilty and also need some improvement in streamlining. And one of those areas also that we've noticed is, and what I think D&D is also trying to do, is to make sure that when we do have units and they are being rented and they are being managed by your companies, that eviction data is also put out there as well to make sure that we're very clear that not only are you trying to make units available, but when you are actually evicting people as well. I don't know if you have that information. It wasn't called for today, but that would be worth also talking about as well. How many Boston residents are actually being put out of your units that you are managing as well, not just the frustration for us is global. Sure. It isn't just about keep putting people in housing, it's also about keeping them there. And so, and I would also encourage you, developers, to rise to the occasion to help with that. In terms of the and also with the applications, I've sat with people and done the multiple applications, and I remember Peabody having an application, Avalon having an application, and so on and so forth. So when you were talking about how there's so many different applications, have you guys thought to come together? I mean, you are free-willed, private market, to sit down and do an application together and come up with something.
Absolutely. Our director of admin and compliance, her name is Doreen Donovan. She worked for Mass Housing for many, many years. She's actually on a committee of various individuals who are trying to come together and get a universal application so we can, cut down on the multiples. So that is definitely something that's been in the works.
Sure. So tell me more about the private markets leadership there, beyond the conversation. I know we called for a uniform one from the city, but it seems like if we're that inefficient at the city level and we're not able to move a uniform application, it seems like the top maybe 10 developers in Boston could right now put your heads together and come up with one application.
It shouldn't be that difficult, absolutely not.
I
And
would
it's a
say- I'm
preliminary
asking you,
application.
right? Yeah,
We
no,
should
so
be
I'm just
asking for basic information. It's just
Right.
very basic, streamlined. It's once that person is offered a unit and we start the interview process, at that point, yes, then we get into a more detailed application, asking for all, everything that we need to help determine eligibility. But I'm with you. Initially, it should be very, very basic with minimal information.
No, it should be very, very efficient, I would think,
Well,
for the
as
private
well.
market to get together.
Yes.
And just
Oh,
go ahead and do
absolutely.
it, right?
We are. I sat on a committee yesterday with CHAPA, Rachel Heller, and that was a discussion of it, was how do we simplify the application process? Who administers that? How does the database look? How's the application look? How do we make it so much easier for applicants, not only just the application, but access to housing? Because
Right.
there's so many affordable units and so many different programs across the whole entire Commonwealth, not just in the city of Boston, that we have people, dozens of us, contacting us every single day saying what housing is, in Rentham, or what housing is in Framingham or anywhere else. So we are. I mean, we're trying to do that. And the city has, to their credit, the online application we think is hugely efficient. It really does improve the process. They didn't ask for any of our input, even though I was submitting many, many pages of notes on things that I thought that they needed to look out for, things to consider, issues with programming, points of clarity. They didn't, it's still like kind of in its beta phase, I'd say. It's like the application 1.0. So hopefully there will be improvements with that, but it's a good model to follow for other properties. There's a lot of inherent difficulty, though, in coming up with one single application when every program has a little different nuances and income limits are a little bit different, priorities can be a little bit different, but I mean, we are trying to tackle that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you both for being here and being so patient until we got to your panel. Of the two companies that you represent, can you talk about, or do you have the numbers on the number of units that you might have available right now for occupancy that are vacant?
I don't have that information. I can tell you we have 3 properties, again, that are all in the Boston area. So it's Coppersmith Village, which is in East Boston. We're actually doing the application phase on that right now. And there are 41, again, affordable units. Actually, 8 of those are homeless, so those are direct referrals from Home Start, and then the remainders are 60%. As I mentioned earlier, we have Harmon Apartments that's in Dorchester, and there's approximately 37 units there. The lottery has not been conducted, but the application process has ended on that one, so unfortunately, we still welcome everyone to apply, by all means, and of course, they do go on a post-lottery wait list, if you will. And then our other property is West Roxbury, or actually it's called Oak Row, which is in West Roxbury. That is one of the IDP properties that they were speaking about earlier. There's 10 affordable units on that. As far as additional vacancies, it's a little tough because, again, when you're talking about HUD properties, there are existing wait lists, and we need to fill those with those individuals that are on the wait list for those individual properties. If the wait list is closed, then they're not accepting additional applicants at this time, but I mean, we can certainly try to pull some numbers together for you as well.
I'd say we have about 40 to 50 ourselves across 4 different properties. And those properties, the lotteries were back at the end of 2017. And we're still trying to fill those units. We have active waiting lists for 70%, 100%, 120% units.
Wait, so can you just say that one more time? So you have 50 units?
40 to 50, I'd say.
40 to 50, so 40 units that were ready to be occupied the end of last year,
Yep.
and the lottery has happened,
Lottery happened last year.
and you're just waiting for the certification, all that sort of stuff to happen?
Well, so some of them, the units were coming, we ran the lottery, the screening from the leasing offices, and then the turnover of households, because one thing that happens is some applicants apply to multiple lotteries. And right now, they have no incentive, there's no deposit that they have to give, and they can they can reserve units for many months at multiple properties without anybody knowing, And then what happens is when we go through the certification process with them and say, congratulations, you can move forward for a unit at the Benjamin in the Seaport, they say, oh, thank you, but I moved into a unit 2.5 months ago at another property. And so then we go, and then the management company, because we're not the management company, we're not the developer, we're entirely a consultant that helps try to navigate this process for the developers and for the management companies. We get hired by both. But so then the management company will go to the next household on the waiting list, screen them, get them to reserve a unit, and then that 3-4 month process starts again. So that's where we are right now. Those are, out of 40 units, that's out of about 200 units that came online at the end of last year. And you don't get all 200 units reserved and moved into in one fell swoop. There's this kind of long tail at the end of it, if you will, of a little bit of churn, you know, from households that end up getting certified and don't move in. Which is a concern why when you have an applicant, and a lot of this is transparency and, you know, trying to provide applicants with as much information as possible. And I would understand, I would do the same thing. If I could reserve 3 different units and I wanted to live in Brighton, but I came up earlier in something in the South End, and I'm waiting for my application to be processed, and then the leasing office in Brighton says, hey, we have a unit available for you, I would say, great, I'm going to reserve that one too. And so it's not a fault of the applicants, it makes sense, but there's just really nothing in place to prevent them from doing that. The city doesn't even have a database of all the households who have reserved units, so that like a management company could then check when they say, okay, congratulations, you have a unit reserved. Oh, I see that you have another reservation at this other property in a different part of town. In some requirement that would require the applicant to make a decision at that point, because there's a certain, you can accommodate applicants so much, but if you accommodate them too much, it's to the detriment of everybody that's waiting behind them on these waiting lists. And so when you give an applicant the ability to reserve 3 units, well, the applicants that are on the waiting list of these 2 properties that they're not going to move into, it's going to take them that much longer to actually get to move into those units because they're occupying units that they're not planning on moving into. And so there is this fine balance between how do you ensure that applicants are getting an absolutely fair choice and access to units and getting to move into the place that they want to, but not at the detriment of having vacancies that go 6-9 months as a result of that.
Thank you.
Councilor Campbell?
No, just thank you guys for your patience in your testimony. And I was going to ask a similar question to Councilor Essaibi-George on just sort of the numbers that we're talking about. That would be helpful. And I knew Peabody was involved with the Harmon Project, which is in D4, and been following that and sending folks to you guys just to be a part of that process who are interested in those units, which of course are very specialized, right?
Absolutely. Everyone
so people
is
have been
ADA
waiting a really
accessible.
long time.
Yeah.
So learned a great deal about just sort of some of the hiccups in the process and in the system, and where we can do better, where you guys can do better, more like rebuilding the trust so we can do better together. So this was helpful, so thank you.
I'm concerned about that property specifically because it is taking so long. And
Yeah.
I am worried that we're going to get the CO and we're not going to be able to house people as quickly as we want. We are dealing with a very specialized population of primarily disabled individuals, and it does take them a little bit longer to be able to set up an appointment and come in and see us. So that in and of itself is going to delay it. So when we're being delayed on the front end, again, it makes me a little bit nervous. And, unfortunately for the developer and the owners, these are tax credit units. They have a delivery date of December 31st.
Yeah.
And if they don't meet it by then, they lose an enormous amount of money. So then the pressure is then back on us again to do everything we possibly have to do to make sure we get those units, occupied with these individuals. So it's going to mean a lot of long hours, but that's what we do.
No, this was helpful. Thank you, and thank you for highlighting that project in particular.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up to that project in particular, the Harmon project? How through the fair housing were you able to set those requirements for the with individuals with more severe disabilities?
This one is definitely very unique. So it was set up, there are preferences. So one of the things that we had to do is actually the owners created a preference sheet with features of the unit and services that are provided by the Boston Home. which is right next to the facility. And we haven't gotten there yet, and it's making me extremely nervous because I don't know how we're going to do this. It's going to be one of those really complicated sorts because there's obviously a Boston preference, a residency preference. So the first thing is ADA. Whoever needed an ADA unit because they have some type of disability, they're going to be top of the preference list. And then we're going to look at those features and those services. And ownership is still trying to determine whether they want to make the services a priority or the features. But there's like 13 features and there's like 6 preferences. And they're going to then break them up like 1 to 4, 5 to 9, 9 to 13 for the features, and then do the same for services. So then we're going to have to take those and kind of group those in to just determine who needs them, really needs those features and those services, and then kind of create the wait list and the preference list based on all of that. I don't think it's something that's ever been done before. So again, it's going to be a very interesting sort to go through all of that. It's going to take a while to do it.
Thank you.
But there wasn't really any fair because again, we're treating everyone the same. So.
Okay, so at this point, we're over 3 hours, and we're going to move to public testimony. So I'm just going to call out 4 names, and you can come to either of the microphones. I have Hillary Pizer, Sherry Mills, I think it's Chris Pescia, Jennifer Gillen, Steve Farrell. Any of those individuals here? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Hillary Pizer.
Hi.
I'm representing the Mass Affordable Housing Alliance. I can be really brief.
Sure.
Just wanted to offer, in addition to MetroList, I administer an online searchable database where people who create an account, I get from people like Brian Engler and Peabody Properties that just homeownership units. I have been getting the NHI units from D&D. I have not regularly been getting IDP units from the BPDA and haven't been able to find a contact there to make that work. But that's something where people can just go to our website, you create an account, very simple, and then you specify where you might like to live. And it can be 1 neighborhood, it could be 18 towns, it can be 5 neighborhoods of Boston. And then every time I post a unit in a neighborhood that this person has specified, they get an email that says, hey, somebody just posted a unit that you might be interested in. You should go to their site and check it out.
Thank you.
So that's just another resource for people who are looking. And love to work with the BPDA, just like we work with D&D, and people throughout the Commonwealth. It's not just Boston.
Right.
And that's just another resource. And if your constituents want to figure out how do I know about these things, that's one way to know about them.
Excellent. Thank you. Is Sherry here still, or Chris, Jennifer, Steve, Farrell? All right, moving on to the next set. Jason Fernstrom, Janice McManus, Verna Skeet, Jean Shirley, Kathy Brown, Nino Brown as well.
Hi, my name is Jean Shirley. Can you hear me okay? So much to mention. So I just recently hooked up with the group Boston Homeless Solidarity Committee. Met Michael on Sunday, and he asked if I would be willing to come here and speak. I will try to be quick. There's just so much to mention. I was homeless on the streets from June of 2015 to June of 2017. I was fully employed. I was never not employed. I actually work on Beacon Hill. It didn't make any sense to me how this could happen. I was born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts. Lived here the majority of my life. I left here when I was 30 years old because I couldn't afford to raise my children here. So I had to move to the suburbs. But I ended up coming back to Boston because of a snowstorm of things. economy, housing crisis during 2008, domestic violence, couldn't keep a roof over my head, couldn't keep a roof over my children's head, so I ended up moving back in, moving back in with my parents who were in their 80s, who were born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm a fifth-generation Bostonian. My entire family, as far back as I know, has always lived in Boston. So when I was living in Boston, living under my parents' roof, working in Boston, became homeless in Boston, I couldn't wrap my head around it. I have a lot to offer, and I just couldn't wrap my head around it. A lot of people couldn't wrap their head around it, but it happened, and it was real. I had an accident playing with my son over at Castle Island. He's my youngest, and I broke my ankle, and that was on June 14th of 2015. And 2 weeks later, my parents, who had lived in Hyde Park for 45 years, because of age and health, they had to, they were thinking about moving out of the city. They thought it would take about 6 months to sell their home. It took 1 day. So on June 30th, they sold their home, and I was having surgery on my ankle. And when I went into rehab after having surgery, after leaving rehab, I had nowhere to go. So I ended up at the Barbara McGinnis house. And after the Barbara McGinnis house, I was there for about 3 weeks, and then I had nowhere to go. So I hobbled over to Rosie's place with my crutches and my green garbage bag, which was holding all of my belongings. And I started that journey of moving along, trying to figure out where I was going to stay every night, trying to get to work every day by 8:30 in the morning on Beacon Hill, up the hill with crutches. Not fun. Meanwhile, I'm a single mother with 3 children. I had to forfeit custody of my children to my ex-husband, who was my abuser, because I couldn't put a roof over our head. When I talk about the children, that's where I lose it. That woman that spoke earlier, I got so emotional because I could feel her pain. I know her pain firsthand. You guys were talking about how inundating and the paper, and I don't know how they expect homeless people to keep track of all the paper, the applications, the letters that you get back from people saying that you're on their list. In 2017, when I got housed in June of 2017, I live right down here at Avalon North Station through a lottery. My rent is $1,600 a month, and I got an affordable unit. So when you guys talk about the debate about affordable units, $1,600 a month for a single mother of 3 children is not affordable. But I was homeless, and I took it. It's a very, very huge struggle every single month. But I'm not becoming homeless again, so I don't know how I'm going to pull that off. I have a full-time and a part-time job and 3 children. When I moved into that place, I had to take all of my paperwork with me because I didn't want to lose one piece of paper, because all of it is very important. If you don't keep track of the paperwork that they give you, that you send out, it's all got your social on it. It has you have to submit your pay stubs, your tax returns, all of that important documents that the World Wide Web tells you to be very careful with. You're sending it to people. Lots of my applications got lost, so I have no idea where my socials are. It's out there somewhere. When I moved in, I had a 30-gallon Rubbermaid bin.
I'm going to give you a 30-second warning.
Okay, so I had a 30-gallon Rubbermaid bin full of all of my paper because I was trying to keep track of it all. When I moved in there, I was working with Home Start to get the rapid rehousing funding. 2.5 months later, because they hadn't gotten the rapid rehousing funding to the leasing office, I got an eviction notice after being homeless for 2.5 years. So what I ended up having to do is scan that eviction notice, find out the email of the person who was the top dog over at Home Start, and say, yo, what's happening? I am not becoming homeless. That is only 2 of the many, many things that happen while you're out there for 2.5 years. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much for your powerful testimony. I'm going to call up Carolyn Royce, Vanessa Langley, Stephen as well, to come to the front. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Kathy Brown, and I work for the Boston Tenant Coalition. And the Boston Tenant Coalition is a coalition of tenant, housing, homeless, and community groups working to try to get more low-income housing and protect and expand tenant rights. And I'm really glad that you're doing this hearing. It would be really great to have some other hearings. We didn't realize, but we thought that it was kind of more narrowly focused on the issue of
Vacant affordable housing units.
the waiting units. So we didn't mobilize, but this is an issue that's Boston Tenant Coalition has, inclusionary development has played a leadership role in the campaigns around inclusionary development when it was formed in 2000 and 2005 when some improvements were made, 2013, and we're having an organizing meeting tomorrow. I mean, we've been working on this throughout. We have a coalition that's been working on inclusionary development, bigger issues and smaller issues, and we're really excited that this year the mayor has said that he's willing to look at the big issues in terms of the set-aside, the length of affordability, the affordability levels, all those things. So in addition, so just in relation to the set-aside numbers, we're saying most advocacy groups, and what we had in our coalition before when we'd had 1,000 signatures, whatnot, was asking for 25%. And in Jamaica Plain, where I live, that's what the JP Neighborhood Council asked for, is 25% affordable. And just through pushing, we definitely have gotten some developers to do more, and just through organizing. So I really think that we should look at larger numbers, and also, as so many people have spoke about, the bigger issue in terms of the overall housing plan and the mismatch of the impact of the 53,000 units, that I think that those issues should be looked at more than, what's best for developers in terms of, getting market units online. So anyway, I think that's really important. I guess I want to say a few things. And anyway, we have actually done some studies on operation and issue of, several of these different issues, including the tax revenue, which is a really important point around using all this tax revenue that has come in from housing, towards affordable housing. But just on IDP, I guess a couple of issues. On the bigger issue of affordability, it is so out of whack, and you're talking about the area median, Boston median income, and that's really good. And what's really important, I know that we've sent this information to you before, but when you look by race and you look at median incomes, Latino residents are it would cost twice the median income of Latinos to afford a 70% of rent. It is almost half for Black, Asian tenants. It's just the 70% is so out of whack.
30 more seconds.
What? 30 more seconds. Okay, all right. Just a couple of things. While it's great that it's being switched over to D&D, and D&D, we've been working them on some fair housing work that's really important, and that's what I want to emphasize as it's moving over to, as it has moved over in terms of efficiency, and I think that will work really well, but it's really important that the fair housing lens is really strong and center. I mean, you spoke about this before, Councilor Edwards, in terms of the importance and sort of the history, why we have all these regulations and whatnot. And also in terms of marketing, I mean, in the last city's fair housing plan, there was a thing of the city should market all the affordable units in one place, versus all these different places. And also, the nonprofits and the home center, that was actually in their affordable housing plan, saying the home center should market all the units. And I was just actually helping people fill out applications for the COHIV project in Dorchester, the Coalition of Occupied Homes in Foreclosure, and because luckily it was really great, BPDA on an IDP project is helping the rich developer who's doing a project down here in Beacon Hill, is doing his IDP requirement by redeveloping some foreclosed properties for affordable units, so that is really good. But we were taking all these applications, and so many of the people couldn't afford the 70% AMI units again. But people are putting the proposals in, whatnot, but it would be great to have more conversations about a number of these issues and with all the organizations that are working on these issues locally and citywide.
Thank you. Are you Nino? Sir? Are you? No, you're not testifying? Okay. There's Stephen Ciargui, I can't read the last name, PJ Sloan, I think, Mary Young, and Yvette Jaro. I have yes, yes, yes to testify, so you can come to the microphone if you want to.
I was told to bring 6 copies of everything. It has pictures and stuff in it. Thanks a lot. Okay, my family renovated many buildings in the South End in the early 80s. We did a building at 55 Clarendon Street. At the same time, we were doing a building on
I
Worcester.
said several names. What was your name?
PJ Stone.
Okay, PJ. Thank you.
And at the same time, we were doing a building on Worcester Square. In Worcester Square, we were some pocket doors inside the building that we adapted, jerry-rigged, to be the front doors of 55 Clarendon Street. And so we've had but the doors were made to be hanging doors as opposed to hinge doors. So they've been so heavy over all these years. We spent thousands and thousands of dollars since the 80s renovating.
I'm not sure if you're in the right place.
Oh, you're kidding?
This is a hearing on vacant affordable units.
Oh. I had a hearing at 5 o'clock. The woman across the thing sent us into this room.
Yeah, no, I don't think you're in the right place.
Oh, okay.
That's okay.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Do you know where we're supposed to go?
Piemonte.
Piemonte on the other side. So if you just take a left and then you first right.
So we're going to conclude unless anyone has testimony that they'd like to give very briefly. All right, thank you so much for coming. This concludes our hearing on 1040.